Hey guys, tonight we slip into the fog-draped streets of Casal di Principe, where shadows cling to walls and names are sometimes whispered with reverence, sometimes not at all. This isn't your usual mafia tale of gunfire and fast cars. No, this one settles in like damp earth under your fingernails, quiet, unshakable, and patient. We're walking alongside a man who didn't need to shout to command a region. Francesco Schiavone, nicknamed Sandokan after a fictional pirate, rises not in grand style but like a weed through broken cement, slow and uninvited. And trust me, you probably won't survive this world without learning when to nod, when to look away, and when to disappear altogether. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, post your location and your local time in the comments. I love seeing where and when you're listening from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The town of Casal di Principe never sets out to be remarkable. Just a scattering of flat-roofed homes across Campania, Italy. The sort of place you drive through without lowering the radio. In the 1980s, it looks harmless, almost tired. But beneath those beige walls and sleepy markets lies a heartbeat irregular with fear. People here understand silence like a second language, and those who speak out, well, they don't stay loud for long. It begins, as these stories often do, with a single quiet force that no one notices at first. A teenager with eyes that rarely blink and hands that already know the difference between begging and bargaining. Francesco Schiavone walks like someone older, someone used to being watched. His classmates call him Sandokan, half mocking, half afraid. They think it's funny at first, this comparison to an old TV pirate with a mustache and a machete. But when one of them goes missing after a stupid fight, no one jokes anymore. Schiavone doesn't talk about that fight. He doesn't have to. The police mark it as missing presumed runaway. His neighbors call it something else in private. It's the first time the town senses a shift, like when dogs stop barking all at once. Something ancient, unspoken. And Sandokan? He keeps selling cigarettes behind the market stalls like nothing happened. By 18, he's already collecting debts, small ones at first. A butcher who owes money for unlicensed meat. A car mechanic behind on protection fees. Francesco doesn't yell, he doesn't threaten. He just shows up, quiet as smoke, and stays until the cash appears. Sometimes he leaves with more than cash. A car. A ring. Once, a cousin of a debtor who was offered as compensation, sent to work in Naples, never heard from again. People start paying on time. There's a story, maybe legend, maybe not, about a man who refused to pay his weekly quota, said he didn't owe anything, said Sandokan was just a boy with a nickname. They found him 3 days later, face down in a well. Not beaten, not shot, just drowned. His wife left town the next day. Took nothing but her wedding photo and a bag of clothes. No police report. No fuss. That well? Covered up. Forgotten. But everyone walks a little faster past that spot now. The market becomes Schiavone's court. He walks through it like a priest through a chapel. People nod. They call him Franco now, not Sandokan. It's safer that way. His crew, boys who once played soccer with him, now carry knives, wear watches they didn't buy, and ride motorbikes that cost more than their fathers earn in a year. They don't smile much. Then comes the rain. It pours one spring, flooding streets and homes alike. Municipal workers don't come. The town waits, and then, quietly, like a favor never asked, Franco sends his men. Pumps, sandbags, cleanup crews, all free, or so it seems. Weeks later, every business in the flood zone receives a new invoice, not from the government, from Sandokan. This is the real lesson. He doesn't need bullets to rule. He needs loyalty purchased in crisis, cemented with fear, and enforced by the knowledge that even when help arrives, it has a cost. And once you've accepted it, you belong to him. There's a historical fact here, buried deep like one of Schiavone's secrets. In the 1980s, Italy's government was hemorrhaging control in southern regions. The vacuum of authority created an opening, not for revolutionaries, but for businessmen with quiet teeth. The Camorra, unlike the Sicilian Cosa Nostra, didn't need old-school rules or rituals. They were faster, meaner, modern. Schiavone, in many ways, was the embodiment of that evolution. Less godfather, more CEO of shadows, and yet many people still think that had the state invested properly in those years, in roads, hospitals, jobs, figures like Schiavone would never have risen so far. So what do you think? Was he a symptom or the disease itself? One night, as the town prepares for a local feast, someone notices the mayor sharing wine with Franco. They're laughing, toasting. The same man who once ran on cleaning up local crime now raises a glass to it. No one says a word, but the kids remember. The next generation learns that loyalty matters more than law, that smiling with the boss gets you further than voting for the right man. And in the middle of it all, Francesco Schiavone stands quiet, watching, listening. Every new silence is a currency, and he's learned to count without using his hands. The Casalesi clan is not yet famous, not yet feared across the country. But the roots are growing, curling beneath the town like vines under floorboards. And Franco, the boy once mocked as a pirate, is slowly becoming something far more dangerous. A man who no longer needs to speak to be obeyed. The rain never truly leaves Casal di Principe. Even when the sun breaks through, the streets feel wet with memory, of debts paid in silence, of handshakes that carried more than agreement. It's 1981 now, and Francesco Schiavone no longer blends into the crowd. He doesn't need to. He's become a fixed point in town, like the church steeple or the market fountain. Something people look at without really looking. The nickname still follows him, Sandokan, but now it clings to him with reverence. Fewer people remember the pirate stories it came from. Fewer still would dare to say it to his face. What they do remember is how he stepped into the vacuum the moment the last boss disappeared. How, unlike the flashier Camorra figures in Naples, he didn't waste time on cigars or nightclub photos. Sandokan stayed local, grounded, controlled. He opens his first front business that spring, a humble fruit and vegetable stall with no customers and no actual fruit. It's a joke, really, except no one laughs. Everyone knows the stall is just a ledger with a roof. Money comes in, none goes out. The taxes get paid. The police nod and keep walking. It's not about fooling anyone. It's about playing by rules that don't actually apply. Like a game of Monopoly where only one person has the real money, Schiavone begins to formalize his control, not just through violence, but with something more durable. Memory. He remembers who paid late, who talked back, who needed help when no one else showed up. A man once asked for a loan to repair his roof. He got the money the next day in a brown envelope, no questions asked. 2 months later, he hosted an anti-Camorra speaker in his house. The next morning, A fire started in the kitchen. Accidental, of course. No one hurt. But the roof caved in. The message was obvious. Debts are never paid off. They just change shape. Around this time, Francesco starts bringing in men from outside Caserta. Not flashy killers, but quiet men. Skilled. Observant. Former soldiers, some say. A few ex-cops who liked their pension better when it was folded inside cash envelopes. These men don't bark orders. They don't throw punches in the street. They arrive, take notes, make calls. Then someone disappears. Or reappears, changed. One of them, a man with a crooked nose and a fondness for crossword puzzles, is placed in charge of local garbage collection. Not sanitation, garbage. Because garbage means trucks. Trucks mean routes. Routes mean access. And suddenly, the Casalesi clan controls not just who eats, but what gets thrown away and where. You want to open a bakery? Great. But your waste goes through their man. You don't pay? Maybe the garbage just doesn't get picked up for a week. Maybe rats come. Maybe the health inspector gets an anonymous tip. Francesco doesn't raise his voice about this. He rarely even visits the town center anymore. He lets his silence do the walking. There's a mainstream historical thread here worth noting. In the 1980s, the Italian government began a series of superficial crackdowns on organized crime. Raids, arrests, television campaigns about clean hands. But the deeper structures, municipal contracts, waste management, real estate development, were left untouched. These were seen as too complex, too embedded in the economy to disturb. The result? Men like Schiavone didn't just survive the cleanup, they grew rich from it. He starts dressing differently. Still modest, but with a sharpness now. Crisp white shirts, good shoes, always clean-shaven, a politician's appearance, not a criminal's. His wife, Maria, keeps her distance publicly, but is rumored to run several of the clan's laundering fronts, hair salons, bridal shops, a boutique that sells dresses no one can afford, but somehow stays open year-round. They have children, but Francesco rarely appears with them. Some say it's for their safety. Others whisper that he views fatherhood the same way he views leadership, something best managed from behind a closed door. There's a story told by one of his early associates, a man who later turned pentito, an informer. He claimed that Francesco once sat at a dinner table with 3 men who had betrayed the clan in minor ways. Nothing unforgivable. One had skimmed off a contract. One had slept with the wrong woman. The third had failed to pass on a message. At the end of the meal, Francesco simply stood up, nodded, and left the room. All 3 men were gone by morning. The details are fuzzy. Maybe it happened, maybe it didn't. But the power of the story was never in the facts. It was in the silence that followed. People started watching their own shadows. By 1983, the Casalesi clan is no longer just a name. It's a brand, a label whispered with caution in Naples. And Schiavone, he is its invisible CEO. His operations span logistics, construction, waste, extortion, even the local lotteries, but always with precision. No messy killings in public, no blood in the streets unless it's been carefully swept first. A young priest once gives a sermon denouncing organized crime. He speaks with fire, calls for resistance, urges mothers not to raise sons into violence. 2 weeks later, he resigns and moves to Sicily. No scandal, no threats, just a quiet departure. His replacement begins his first homily with a story about forgiveness. Lesson learned. Francesco begins to shape not just the economy of Casal di Principe, but its soul. Fear becomes cultural. Children grow up mimicking his gestures. One schoolteacher remarks how her students start avoiding eye contact during roll call. They're learning early how to be invisible. And in this town, invisibility is a kind of survival. Here's something close to the character that history doesn't always print. Francesco Schiavone was never obsessed with being loved or even respected. He wanted control, yes, but more than that, he wanted permanence. A kind of legend that wouldn't fade even if his face did. He used silence the way others use speeches. He built memory the way others build prisons. Still, cracks begin to show. A rival crew in a nearby town tries to push into his waste management contracts. A warehouse burns. No deaths, just damage. Francesco responds by buying the rival crew's front business the next week. He pays double the asking price and never uses it. The building sits empty, a monument to his patience. Many people still think that if the government had stepped in with stronger oversight, more consistent economic support, and fewer under-the-table handshakes, the Casalesi might have remained a local nuisance instead of a national threat. But the truth is, bureaucracy always moved slower than ambition. And Sandokan's ambition had already spread far past the borders of Campania. One evening, a shipment of electronics goes missing from the docks in Naples. Customs officials find nothing. No paper trail, no witnesses. But 2 weeks later, every Casalesi-affiliated storefront seems to be running special sales on televisions and stereos. No one asks questions, and if they do, they get answers that don't make much sense but somehow feel enough. In Casal di Principe, people stop looking for clean truths. They look for safe ones, and so the empire continues to rise, brick by brick, lie by lie, quietly, persistently, like mold behind wallpaper. And at the center of it all sits Francesco Schiavone, not waving guns, not barking orders, just watching, just remembering. The pirate boy is long gone. But Sandokan, the boss, the myth, the breath in the back of your neck, he's very much alive. The sun rises over Campania like it always does, slow and golden, but the people of Casal di Principe are already awake. They open their shutters without hope, nod to the same neighbors they no longer trust, and head into streets paved by men like Francesco Schiavone. By 1984, fear is no longer the exception. It's the air. It weighs on fruit vendors, school teachers, priests, even the mayor. And in the middle of it all, Sandokan walks less and listens more. He's learned a trick from Naples. Don't just control the streets, control what fills them. Garbage, cement, bread. Infrastructure is destiny, and destiny can be bribed. There's a warehouse near the outskirts of town that everyone knows but no one names. It's just there. Trucks enter and leave at strange hours. No sign on the front. No paperwork anyone can find. But if you need something, a shipment rerouted, a license approved, a sudden accident for a competitor, that's where the phone rings. And someone always answers. One man, a former baker turned middleman, claims he once delivered pastries to the warehouse. Just once. What he saw, he never says. Only that when he got home, he burned his apron and gave up baking for good. He now sells insurance. Francesco's growing operation has its own rhythm now. It expands without announcements. A pizzeria opens with money no one saw. A contractor wins bids he never entered. And all of it flows into a ledger that isn't kept on paper. It's remembered in gestures, favors, a nod at a funeral, a seat at a wedding. A Camorra historian once noted that the Casalesi were the most business-minded clan in Italy. Not the bloodiest, Not the most dramatic, but the most efficient. And behind that efficiency stood a man who never lost his temper in public. Schiavone starts holding meetings, not flashy affairs with champagne and cigars, but tight gatherings in basements and back rooms. He speaks little, lets others talk, and when they finish, he makes 1 or 2 sentences that shape entire neighborhoods. He's no longer useful. Raise the price. Move the boy. No elaboration, no repeats, and God help anyone who misunderstands. There's a debt collector named Angelo who's been with him since the early days. Loyal, smart. But one day, he makes the mistake of showing up drunk to a meeting, laughs too loud, spills some wine. Francesco watches him quietly and says nothing. The next week, Angelo is transferred, sent to a distant town to oversee minor collections. He's never invited to another meeting. He isn't killed. That would be wasteful. He's just erased from the inner circle. And in this world, that's worse than death. In time, people stop using Francesco's name. Even in private, even when drunk, they call him Louis, him, as if saying the word is enough, as if adding anything else would invite attention or correction. Now, here's something close to the man himself, something only his old driver would remember. Francesco doesn't like loud music in the car. He prefers the window slightly open, even in winter. He never eats on the move. And when they stop at traffic lights, he looks straight ahead, never at the people. He once told his driver, "Looking at people is how you start caring, and caring is a liability." He's not cruel for sport. He's not warm for show. He's just exact. In 1985, a new supermarket chain tries to move into Caserta province, backed by Milan money. Corporate, sterile, and clean. The kind of operation that doesn't pay street tax. The kind of operation that hires its own security. For a while, it goes well. Locals like the bright aisles, the low prices, the idea of something normal. But then strange things happen. Trucks delayed, power outages. A health inspector finds rats where there were none. Customers stop coming. The investors pull out within 6 months. The building is sold to a local construction firm. A week later, it's bulldozed. A parking lot appears in its place, with cameras. Facing nowhere in particular, that lot now belongs to one of Francesco's nephews. There's a fact worth noting here. Italy's anti-mafia laws wouldn't gain real teeth until the 1990s. Before that, much of what happened in Caserta existed in a legal gray fog. Prosecutors tried to build cases, but witnesses vanished. Paper trails evaporated. Judges were relocated or sometimes simply found other priorities. A lawyer once tried to take on one of Schiavone's shell companies, filed a complaint, gathered evidence. The morning of his hearing, he found his office ransacked. Nothing stolen, just everything rearranged. Photos turned backward, chairs stacked upside down, files opened but not taken. He dropped the case, moved to Genoa, never came back. Many people still think that, had he pressed on, others would have followed, that a line might have been drawn. But here's the quiet truth. No one wants to be the first body in a war they didn't start. Francesco's methods remain subtle. He prefers influence to explosion. But make no mistake, when a message needs sending, it arrives on time. A store owner who suddenly stops paying protection finds his front window broken, not once, but every Saturday for a month. By the 5th week, he's paying again. With interest, even his enemies learn the rule. Silence buys time. Outrage buys risk. And then there's the incident with the photographer, a young man, recently returned from university in Rome, decides to document life under the Camorra. He walks the streets with a Leica and a bold grin, snaps shots of men outside bars, unmarked cars, local markets. One of those shots accidentally includes Francesco's cousin, unmistakable even in sunglasses. The photographer is never threatened, never harmed. He's simply offered a new job, teaching history at a remote high school in Calabria. It comes with free housing, a bonus, and a note. Your lens deserves a quieter frame. He accepts. The photos are never published. That's the thing about power. Real power doesn't need noise. It doesn't beg headlines. It just bends people, quietly, cleanly, until the shape of resistance disappears. By 1986, the Casalesi clan holds more than the town. It holds expectation. People begin to measure their decisions not by laws, but by whether Francesco would approve. A woman selling flowers in the square changes her supplier, not because the old one raised prices, but because the new one is connected. No one told her to do it. She just knew. That's the real measure of dominance. When people obey not out of fear, but out of rhythm. At night, Schiavone sits alone on his terrace, drinking espresso with no sugar. He listens to the dogs in the distance, listens for the one bark that sounds wrong. He's not paranoid. He's attentive. There's a difference. Paranoia is messy. Attention is survival. A local boy once asks him, half joking, "Is it true you own the whole town?" Francesco smiles for the first time in weeks, just a twitch of the mouth. "No," he says, "the town just owes me its memory." By 1987, Casal di Principe isn't just under control, it's under spell. The kind of spell where streets stay cleaner than they should, conversations quiet when a certain name hangs in the air, and people start calling the absence of trouble peace, even when it costs them everything. Francesco Schiavone no longer walks the market. He doesn't need to. His decisions move faster than his steps ever could. His presence has become spectral, a power that lives in phones that ring once and don't call back, in folded notes passed under cafe saucers, in public contracts that are signed before they're even drafted. The town runs on a simple engine now, compliance. And Francesco, he's the fuel, the spark, and the mechanic. This year, the Casalesi take a bigger step towards something less emotional and far more strategic. They begin aggressively investing in real estate. Not homes, not shops. Land. Bare, dry, overlooked land along the edges of Caserta province. The kind no one wants. The kind with zoning problems and water access issues. But Francesco knows something others don't. Or perhaps he simply believes harder in what others overlook. He understands that where government fails, ambition thrives. And ambition needs space to expand. The construction boom begins quietly. First, a few permits pushed through by tired city clerks. Then, roads get repaved, a gas line rerouted. Soon, a cement plant opens on the outskirts of the province. Not flashy, not modern, just efficient. Like everything else Sandokan touches, cement is money, but it's also permanence. And permanence is the one thing Francesco seems to be building more than anything else. There's a mainstream historical fact nestled here. In the late 1980s, Italy's infrastructure contracts were a jackpot of corruption. Municipal governments handed out millions in public works, housing, roads, bridges, with almost no oversight. The mafia in Sicily understood this, but the Casalesi clan mastered it. They didn't just extort the builders. They became the builders. and every sidewalk laid down in their name became a line drawn through the future. The shell companies blossom. Names like Ecocementi, Campagna Costruzioni, Delta Impresa, on paper, separate. In truth, all roads lead back to Francesco. He never signs anything, never appears on the board, but he knows when deliveries arrive before the drivers do. He knows when the mayor's nephew is applying for a permit before the form even leaves the desk. And when delays occur, they don't last long. Bureaucracy, like concrete, sets faster under pressure. There's a curious pattern that begins emerging this year. Every new construction zone, whether a civic center, a public housing project, or a school renovation, somehow employs men recommended by the clan. No resume, no interviews, just names on a list. And if someone questions it, the answer is always the same. They're good workers, no trouble. Of course they are. Trouble doesn't last long around Francesco. One day, a local contractor, ambitious, young, clean, tries to bid against one of the Casalesi fronts. He wins, legitimately. Everyone's surprised. For 3 weeks, the job goes forward. Then thefts begin. Equipment vanishes. Workers walk off the job, citing family emergencies. Inspectors show up with complaints. After 2 months, he pulls out. Bankrupted. A week later, the Casalesi firm buys the project for half its value, and construction resumes, without further issue. The lesson isn't subtle. Compete if you want, but don't expect to win without bleeding. Francesco watches all this from behind layers. He rarely appears in person anymore, but when he does, it's memorable. There's one story of him showing up at a political fundraiser, not invited, just walked in with 2 men, said nothing, drank a glass of red wine, and left. The next day, half the town council changed their votes on a zoning ordinance. No threats, no bribes, just presence. That's all it took. And here's something close to his core. Francesco believes in ecosystems, not the kind with plants and birds, but human ones. He understands that everyone wants something, and if you can provide it, cheap rent, a stable job, quiet streets, you don't need to rule with violence. You rule by being the answer no one wants to admit they need. But even ecosystems rot. In a small village nearby, a protest erupts. Locals complain about pollution from one of the Casalesi construction dumps, children getting sick, crops failing. A teacher writes an op-ed in the regional paper. It gains traction. Francesco doesn't respond with force. He responds with absorption. Within weeks, 2 of the protest leaders are hired for community outreach positions. The teacher receives a grant to write educational materials, funded by a Casalesi shell. The op-ed disappears from the paper's archives. By the end of the month, the protests end. Many people still think that if the protests had gone national, if they'd drawn Rome's attention, Francesco might have finally faced real consequences. But the machine knows how to consume outrage. It feeds on it, transforms it, makes it another revenue stream. And so the concrete flows. Construction becomes not just a business, but a symbol. A new library built in the town bears a plaque honoring civic engagement. No one mentions that the cement was supplied by a firm tied to laundering drug money through agricultural subsidies. The children read books printed with ink paid for by blood. But the floors are solid, the lights are on, and no one asks who turned the switch. There's a joke that floats around during this time, whispered only at night. If you dig deep enough in Caserta, you'll find cement or bodies, sometimes both. It's funny, until it isn't. One evening, Francesco drives through town with the windows up, flanked by 2 unmarked vehicles. A boy on a bicycle waves at him. For a moment, Francesco looks up, meets the boy's eyes, and gives a small nod. The boy crashes into a cart, distracted. He's not hurt. But the story spreads. And overnight, the boy becomes something rare, a celebrity. People pat his shoulder. Mothers smile at him. Someone even offers to pay for his textbooks. That's how distorted things have become. A glance from Sandokan is a local honor. And still he isn't satisfied. The real prize is just beyond reach, Naples. Francesco starts making calls. Not direct ones, of course. Always through buffers. He begins laying groundwork for something far more complex. A network that could tie the quiet control of Caserta to the frenetic chaos of Naples. Ports, shipping, customs. A world of opportunity. But the deeper he moves into business, the more visible his empire becomes. He knows it. And for the first time in years, he feels a cold wind blowing. Not from the north, but from within. The kind that whispers, "You're being watched." Still, he continues, because that's who he is. A man who builds while the foundations crack. A man who smiles at the camera, knowing the film will never develop. A man who understands that even if he falls, the cement will still dry, the buildings will still rise, and the silence he crafted will still echo. He doesn't just own land anymore, he owns the future. There's a wedding in Casal di Principe, a big one. Tents, champagne, suits pressed crisp as currency. The groom's father is a building contractor with a suddenly booming business. The bride's uncle is a city councilman, and somewhere among the guests, unnoticed but unmistakable, stands Francesco Schiavone. No announcement, no grand entrance. He simply appears. Like gravity, people part when he passes, not because they're told to, but because it feels natural. A quiet man in a darker suit than most, his hands clasped behind his back. He doesn't drink, doesn't dance, but the fact that he's there means this marriage will be remembered, means the city's next batch of contracts is already spoken for, and just before the cake is cut, Francesco walks over to the groom, clasps his shoulder, and says only, "Build strong, pay fast." That's his version of a blessing. And in Caserta, it's better than gold. These days, Schiavone doesn't need to threaten anymore. His name is enough. But the machinery behind that name, the gears, the wheels, the oil, those are being managed by others. The Casalesi clan has grown beyond one man's grip. It's a structure now, with departments, divisions, specialists. And at the top, Francesco floats like a phantom chairman, visible only when necessary. The rise of his cousin, Francesco Bidognetti, Cicciotto e Mezzanotte, marks a turning point. Bidognetti is different, more emotional, more visible, less disciplined, but he's loyal to Schiavone and carries out orders without hesitation. The two form a dual core, controlling different spheres. Schiavone focuses on construction, contracts, infrastructure. Bidognetti manages narcotics, extortion, and the less elegant parts of the operation. There's a kind of logic to it. Schiavone knows that power stains, and some stains are better left on someone else's hands. Here's a mainstream historical fact to hold on to. During the late 1980s, the Casalesi became one of the most structured and far-reaching Camorra clans in all of southern Italy. Their model wasn't random. It was managerial. They mimicked corporations, complete with hierarchy, specialization, and even performance reviews. A consigliere once joked, "We were the only mafia with annual targets." It's not entirely a joke. Schiavone's world operates on discipline. You arrive on time. You speak when spoken to. You deliver what you promised. No more, no less. Punishment isn't theatrical, it's procedural. A ledger entry, a change in assignment. In rare cases, a disappearance with a footnote no one sees. An associate named Rocco starts skimming from fuel contracts. Not much, just enough to think it wouldn't be noticed. He's summoned to a warehouse on a Tuesday morning. No one sees him leave, but his name is quietly removed from all the books. His family receives a monthly envelope marked arrears. Nothing more is said, not even a funeral. This is how Francesco prefers things. No chaos, no drama, just adjustment. Yet even the cleanest systems produce friction. A prosecutor named Raffaele Cantone begins looking into the Casalesi. He's young, smart, quiet. The kind of man Schiavone would have respected if he weren't digging in the wrong places. Cantone doesn't come at the clan with press conferences or raids. He comes with paperwork, trail by trail, form by form. And Francesco feels the shift immediately. He doesn't panic, he pivots. Lawyers are hired. Real ones. Clean ones. Men with university degrees and perfect ties. They begin challenging small charges, questioning procedures, filing appeals. Nothing major, but enough to stall momentum, enough to muddy the waters. Francesco also increases his distance. Fewer calls, more layers. He tells his inner circle, names are no longer currency, only results. And so his name disappears from more documents, more companies, more land deals. But invisibility is never perfect. There's a construction site in Santa Maria Capua Vetere, a housing project funded with EU development money. On paper, the contractor is a company based in Milan. In truth, every brick is laid by men loyal to the Casalesi. Every receipt flows back to Casal di Principe. One evening, a worker is injured. A minor fall. An ambulance is called. The paramedic notices something strange. None of the workers are registered. No safety gear, no union. He files a report. 2 weeks later, the project is canceled due to funding irregularities. The land is sold to a shell company based in Luxembourg. Within 6 months, the site becomes a private sports complex owned by a man with no background in development. He drives a car with Naples plates and never stays in town more than a day. This is Francesco's world now. A mirror maze of contracts, delays, reassignments, and yet, at the heart of it, the logic remains intact. No waste, no noise, only movement. Still, many people still think that if the judiciary had struck harder during this period, if the files hadn't gotten lost, if the judges hadn't been reassigned, the Casalesi might have fractured. So what do you think? Was the machine too well built? Or was it simply left alone too long? Francesco begins investing in quiet symbols of permanence. Not palaces, schools, clinics. He doesn't fund them directly, of course, but local whispers trace the money. When a new kindergarten opens with shiny tiles and strange silence around its funding, everyone knows whose hands guided the cement. It's a psychological operation as much as a logistical one. The children grow up in buildings he built. The parents walk on roads his trucks paved. And somewhere in their subconscious, they begin to associate normalcy with him. One afternoon, an elderly woman sees him walking through the square alone. She approaches him, tugs lightly on his sleeve, asks if he can help her nephew find a job. Francesco doesn't promise anything, just listens, nods. A week later, the boy is hired as a clerk in a transport firm. No one talks about it, but the woman starts baking again. For the first time in years, gives away bread for free. That's how it spreads, not through fear, through favor. And yet, as 1989 draws to a close, Cracks begin to appear, small, hairline fractures along the empire's perfect edge. A truck full of illegal waste is intercepted in the north. The driver panics, gives a name he shouldn't, a minor, forgettable name. But that name leads to another, and then another. Prosecutors begin forming a picture, not of a gang, but of a syndicate. Francesco gets the report days before the government does. He doesn't raise his voice, doesn't call for blood. Instead, he calls a meeting, his first in months. Only 6 men are invited. They meet in a villa with no electricity, phones left outside, the walls lined with thermal blankets. For 2 hours, they talk softly, review documents, shift priorities, assign new layers of misdirection. When the meeting ends, Francesco pours a single glass of wine, lifts it toward the moonlight, and says, "Nothing lasts forever, but some things outlast the men who built them." Then he drinks. Because even as the machinery spins on, Francesco Schiavone knows what few men at his level are willing to admit. The walls are inching closer. New year, new caution. It's 1990, and the air in Casal di Principe feels different. Not quite fear, not quite calm. Something in between. The streets remain quiet. The stores open on time. The weekly market bustles with the illusion of normal. But beneath it all, there's a hum, a vibration in the concrete. People feel it, even if they can't name it. Francesco Schiavone doesn't change his routine. That, in fact, is the point. He walks through the corridors of his life exactly as before, precisely measured, eyes forward, every meeting scheduled, every silence curated. But inside, the calculations have begun to shift. Rome is beginning to whisper again. The judiciary in Naples is restructuring. There are rumors of mega investigations, of judges brought in from outside, of state-backed prosecutors who won't play by the old rules. One word keeps surfacing in intelligence memos: Casalesi. And with that word, one name, Schiavone. Francesco reads the signs before they're written. He begins retracting his limbs from certain deals, pulling out of waste contracts in favor of more neutral logistics firms, transferring real estate holdings into newer, more obscure fronts. The name Ecocementi vanishes overnight. A new firm, Blue Campagna Holdings, appears in its place, registered in a Swiss border town no one's ever visited. But he doesn't run. That would signal weakness. Instead, he recalibrates. This is the era where Schiavone stops being just a boss. He becomes a strategist, a ghost architect. While other clans squabble over turf and bullets, Francesco leans into bureaucracy. He creates barriers not made of concrete or fear, but of documents, regulations, procedures so complex that even government officials give up halfway through. A famous anecdote: one city councilor, trying to trace the ownership of a parcel of seized land, spends 3 months cross-referencing titles. When he finally thinks he's cracked it, he presents his findings. Schiavone's lawyers submit a 1-page correction and invalidate the entire case. The land remains untouched. The councilor resigns. There's a mainstream historical insight worth anchoring here. In the early 90s, Italy begins shifting its anti-mafia strategy. The days of simply arresting foot soldiers are fading. Now, the state wants to follow the money. It's the age of maxi trials, anti-mafia pool magistrates, and enhanced witness protection. But what makes Schiavone so slippery is that his business is legal until it isn't. And by the time it isn't, the paper trail has already looped back on itself. Still, cracks are forming, not just in the walls of legality, but in Francesco's inner circle. One of his longtime lieutenants, an ambitious logistics man named Ernesto, begins showing signs of independence. He starts negotiating contracts outside the clan's official channels. Nothing blatant, just sloppy. He brags, takes meetings without intermediaries, sends a relative to a council office without permission. Francesco doesn't react immediately. He watches. Ernesto is called in for a review. The meeting lasts 22 minutes. When he exits, he's pale and silent. Within a month, he moves his family to Puglia and retires. His name is never mentioned again, not even by his closest friends. Whatever was said in that room stayed there, because in this world, the most terrifying sentence isn't a threat. It's, "You know what must be done." Francesco begins spending more time at his farmhouse outside town, not in hiding, in preparation. He adds a new wall, installs lights, brings in specialists from abroad, allegedly Eastern Europeans, though no one confirms. He builds escape routes that don't show up on maps. And every night, he walks the perimeter alone. No guards, just a quiet man, hands in his pockets, listening to the wind. Here's something close to the man himself. He keeps no family photos in visible rooms, no wedding pictures, no graduation shots. "Memory," he once said, "should live in your head, not on your shelf." But memory also makes enemies. Francesco's expansion into Naples has made him visible to older Camorra bosses, men who prefer chaos, who see his system as sterile, too clean, too quiet. Whispers begin in Secondigliano and Forcella. Meetings are held. Deals offered behind his back. One crew attempts a hijacking, intercepts a Casalesi truck loaded with unmarked materials headed toward a port warehouse. The cargo vanishes. The driver is released, unharmed but confused. Francesco does not retaliate with violence. He retaliates with removal. Within a month, the rival crew loses all its transport contracts. Banks call in debts. Inspectors visit their warehouses. Partners evaporate. No one is shot. But within 8 weeks, the crew dissolves. Their capo, once cocky and loud, is last seen boarding a ferry to Tunisia. This is how Sandokan fights now, not with bullets, but with absence. Many people still think that had the rival clans unified then, they might have posed a real threat. But they didn't. Because Schiavone had already infiltrated them, not through spies, but through the logic of survival. He made his system too profitable to resist, too efficient to abandon. That's his genius. Not control through fear, but through inevitability. Still, not everyone is content. A younger faction within the Casalesi grows restless. Led by Vincenzo, a nephew of one of the original members, this group believes Schiavone is too slow, too calculated. They want to move into new markets, drugs, arms, international smuggling. They see what the Sicilian mafia is doing and crave that glamour. Francesco, of course, sees them coming before they've even moved. He summons Vincenzo to the farmhouse. It's raining. The meeting lasts only 10 minutes. No shouting, no blood, just a red umbrella leaning against the wall, still dripping. Vincenzo leaves, head down, and within a week, he's promoted, sent to oversee operations in Eastern Europe. Everyone understands what that really means. A one-way ticket with no return clause, but no one objects, because even the ambitious know, Francesco doesn't kill your body. He kills your proximity. The Casalesi reorganize again, this time tighter, more vertical, less personal. By late 1990, Francesco's world looks less like a gang and more like a multinational. There are regional managers, international partnerships, digital banking experiments. His men carry pagers now, use code words, wear suits tailored not for intimidation, but for invisibility. And yet, through all the modernization, His core rules never change. Never speak to outsiders. Never repeat yourself. Never appear twice in the same place in the same week. Even within his closest circle, these rules are gospel. There's one last story from this year. A local journalist, young, eager, and too curious, starts publishing pieces about land transfers. Nothing overtly accusatory, just questions. One day his editor is visited by a man in a gray coat. No threats, just a suggestion. Transfer him to culture reporting. Maybe poetry. Safer. The editor complies. The journalist never writes about land again. But his first poetry column is about silence. And between the lines, there's a bitterness no rhymes can hide. Because by now, everyone knows. Francesco Schiavone doesn't erase words. He rewrites them. And in Caserta, the pen isn't mightier than the sword. It's handed over after the silence has already won. There's a silence that settles in just before dawn. A kind of heavy quiet that doesn't feel peaceful, but suspended, like breath held before a verdict. That's what mornings in Casal di Principe feel like in 1991. As the region stirs awake, the Casalesi clan is already moving. Schedules drawn, deliveries mapped, payments logged. And somewhere within the endless ticking of this quiet empire, Francesco Schiavone is reading a list of names. Not enemies, not allies, just variables. At this point, he isn't managing men anymore. He's managing outcomes. Schiavone's network has grown past what any one person can track. Waste disposal, concrete contracts, port logistics, even livestock trade. It's all tied together in a puzzle with no visible edges. A police raid on a warehouse in Milan reveals boxes of olive oil that, on paper, were exported to Germany 3 months prior. A small grocery chain in Abruzzo is revealed to be owned by a funeral homes holding company, which in turn rents trucks from a firm registered in Slovakia. All roads lead back to Campania. All roads ultimately lead back to him, but no one can prove it. Not yet. The system is too intricate. The layers too dense. Francesco has spent a decade building this opacity, constructing a kind of organizational fog. You might catch a glimpse of a deal or a transfer or a whispered order, but never the whole picture. And certainly never the man himself. This year, Francesco intensifies his relationship with the port of Naples. It begins subtly. A few container companies, a customs liaison who suddenly has fewer inspections, a shipping route that always clears faster than others. Soon, there are whispers that goods moving under certain colors don't get checked at all. The port becomes a gate, and Francesco holds the key. Mainstream historical context. During the early 1990s, the port of Naples became a critical node in both legal and illicit trade. With underfunded oversight and a rising global demand for Mediterranean shipping routes, organized crime found a perfect entry point. For the Casalesi clan, it wasn't about drugs, not yet. It was about dominance. If you control the port, you control the flow. And if you control the flow, you control everything. But flow goes both ways. For the first time, Francesco starts hearing whispers from outside his usual sphere. Rome is watching again, this time with real teeth. A new magistrate team, inspired by the success of anti-mafia prosecutors in Palermo, begins to model a similar long-term offensive in Campania. Not just arrests, but asset freezes, witness protection programs, maxi trials, and quietly, almost imperceptibly, men begin to vanish from Schiavone's network. Not kidnapped, not killed, flipped. They start in the outer layers, drivers, clerks, accountants. But it's enough. Prosecutors begin to piece together patterns. A shipment here, a shell company there, a land purchase signed by a man who died in 1987. Francesco knows its beginning. He calls a meeting. This one not at the farmhouse, but in a funeral home basement. 12 men, all seated in a circle. No phones, no pens. Each man is asked a question, one by one. What do you know that could survive you? It's not a threat. It's an audit. Several leave the meeting with new assignments, some abroad, some underground. One man, longtime associate, doesn't receive a task. By morning, he's gone. No body, no farewell, just a clean room and a whisper. He knew too much, and too little. That's the danger in Francesco's world, being smart enough to matter, but not essential enough to protect. Meanwhile, Francesco begins to build new relationships in the financial sector, not with bankers, but with their systems. He pays for consultants, brings in ex-economists. He wants to know how money moves, not just when or where. He learns about offshore banking, investment instruments, and how to hide €1 million inside 10,000 legitimate ones. One accountant later testifies that Francesco's understanding of fiscal shielding was better than most university professors. Here's something close to the man himself. He once told a junior associate, "Violence is a receipt. It confirms the debt. But money lets you cancel it quietly." Still, violence never disappears entirely. In the spring of 1991, a small-time extortionist named Mario begins operating in Caserta without authorization. He leans on shopkeepers, drops Sandokan's name without permission. He's warned twice. The third time, he's found, not dead, but marked. 4 fingers broken, both kneecaps shattered. He's left outside the same cafe he once threatened, a handwritten note pinned to his jacket. "This name is not yours to use." Mario leaves town the next day. No police report filed. The cafe replaces its windows, and the story becomes a cautionary tale, passed down like folklore, because in Francesco's empire, stories carry more weight than evidence. Another begins to circulate this year. A tale about a town hall clerk who received a wedding invitation with no return address. Inside, instead of a card, was a photograph, his own, taken from across the street the day before. No words, no date, just the image. He calls in sick the next day, and by the end of the month, resigns citing stress. No one fills his position for weeks. These aren't coincidences. They're architecture. And still, many people still think that if Francesco had eased off here, if he'd tightened his circle and halted his expansion, he might have dodged what was coming. But he doesn't stop. He never stops. Because to stop is to collapse. And everything he's built, from the first uncollected debt to the final signed permit, is based on the presumption that forward is the only safe direction. So forward he goes. He expands into medical waste, into trucking unions, into funeral services. He begins organizing the Casalesi like a nation-state. One branch handles logistics, one handles finance, one handles discipline, each with sub-branches, each with a buffer zone. At one point, he even drafts a formal code, an internal constitution for the clan. Not about loyalty, about roles, titles, procedures. Because this is the dream, isn't it? A world where everything can be managed, where risk becomes calculation, where power is not shouted, but printed quietly in 8-point font and filed under miscellaneous, and for a while it works. A state contractor, unaware of who he's dealing with, tries to audit one of Francesco's companies. A week later, his daughter receives a scholarship to study abroad, fully paid, No connection. No note. Just an opportunity. He drops the audit. That's the level they're operating at now. Not just threats or bribes, but the manipulation of destiny itself. But beneath the surface, the cracks continue. A new name surfaces in prosecutor memos. Operation Spartacus. Francesco knows the reference. The slave who led a rebellion. The man who couldn't be broken. He smiles, because if they want a war named after a rebellion, they'd better prepare for what happens when the chains fall. Spring 1992 begins with thunder. Not in the sky, but in the press. Newspapers across Italy carry headlines that, for the first time, say the word Casalesi out loud. Not buried in footnotes or masked behind vague euphemisms like organized elements, but front and center. And next to it, the name Francesco Schiavone. The spell is breaking. It begins with a single arrest. Minor, really. A warehouse clerk tied to a shipping manifest that didn't match customs records. But when the investigators follow the paper trail, they don't find loose ends. They find a web. And in that web, dozens of names, hundreds of contracts, and thousands of transactions traced to shell companies stretching from Belgium to Calabria. The press calls it a quiet explosion, and in some ways that's exactly what it is. The Italian state officially opens Operation Spartacus, a sweeping multi-year investigation targeting the Casalesi clan. It's the largest anti-Camorra investigation in history at that point, and its central hypothesis is chilling in its simplicity, that the Casalesi are no longer a criminal group. They are a state within the state. Francesco Schiavone reads the papers at his kitchen table. He stirs his espresso slowly, doesn't flinch. He has known this moment would come. In fact, he built his world around it, because the truth is, you don't lead an empire like his without preparing for fire. He calls no emergency meetings. There are no shouted orders, no rushed movements. Instead, a slow cascade of precautions begins. Files moved, men reassigned, assets restructured. Shell companies dissolve overnight, only to be reborn under new names in neighboring countries. Cash is diverted. Property titles shifted to wives, cousins, anonymous trusts. He's not hiding. He's hardening. This is the moment where Francesco stops trying to be invisible and instead becomes something far more dangerous, intangible. At the same time, he increases outreach, not to the public, but to institutions. He begins leveraging political ties more openly, men in suits who owe favors, who remember who built the hospital wing in their hometown, who know their campaigns were mysteriously funded in the weeks before an election. He doesn't need them to defend him. He just needs them to hesitate. In private, Francesco starts referring to politicians as daylight collaborators. He doesn't mean it as an insult. He means it as a classification, like temperature or weight. Some people are reliable in the dark. Others only function in the sun, and he knows the storm is coming. The mainstream historical moment here. In 1992, following the assassinations of anti-mafia judges Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino by the Sicilian Mafia, Italy entered a full-scale war against organized crime. Though these attacks were committed by Cosa Nostra, the political pressure created by them spilled across the country, prompting crackdowns in Naples, Calabria, and beyond. The Casalesi clan found itself under unprecedented scrutiny, but unlike the Sicilian bosses, Francesco had no interest in confrontation. He wasn't building an army. He was building insulation. He begins a deep operational review. Every lieutenant, every driver, every handler of every account, one by one. Men who've grown comfortable are replaced. Men who've grown reckless disappear. A senior logistics head is found drowned in a vineyard canal. No investigation, no funeral. His position is filled within a week. Francesco doesn't mourn. He recalibrates. And then, something unexpected. A betrayal. Not from an enemy, from within. A mid-level operative named Carmine, caught transporting documents across the Swiss border, flips. He testifies. He names names. He explains routes. He confirms the rumors about the port, about the funeral homes, about the cement plant that never poured a single slab. He does not name Francesco, because he can't. And that's the brilliance of it. Even those inside don't see the core. But Carmine's testimony is enough to bring indictments, to freeze assets, to justify wiretaps. And slowly, the machine begins to creak. Still, Francesco remains calm. He doubles down on structure, not retaliation. He begins using even more layers of separation. Men no longer speak directly to their immediate superiors. Messages are passed through legal firms, through retired notaries, through widows who collect envelopes from pharmacies. It sounds absurd, but it works. Each layer adds seconds to the clock, and sometimes seconds are all you need. At the same time, he shifts into a kind of spiritual role within the clan. Less daily management, more philosophical leadership. He starts using phrases like, "The family must survive beyond the names, and our legacy is not our actions, but our endurance." And people listen, because Sandokan isn't just a boss anymore. He's a mythology, a living legend whose story mothers tell their sons in the same breath as bedtime prayers and curfews. There's a story from this period, maybe true, maybe not. A young man in Naples is arrested for petty theft. While being processed, he's asked if he's connected to the Casalesi. The boy shakes his head, says, "I wouldn't even speak their name in a dream." That's the kind of fear we're dealing with. But the pressure keeps building. Police raids increase. Houses are searched. Warehouses burned. Men arrested. In court, wiretaps are played. The voices are grainy, coded. But prosecutors hear the patterns, the rhythms, the orchestration. And then a judge disappears. Not killed, not kidnapped, just gone. His car is found parked outside a church. Engine cold. Phone inside. No struggle. No leads. Some say he fled. Others whisper about retribution. But the message is clear. You can investigate the Casalesi, but only if you're willing to vanish with the paper trail. The judge's replacement? A woman from Florence. Sharp, stoic, no children. The papers call her the ICE prosecutor. She immediately orders surveillance on 22 suspects connected to Francesco's world. Francesco doesn't blink. He just shortens his sentences. The phone calls that once carried vague instructions now carry none at all. Just coded check-ins. A knock. A silence. A calendar page mailed to a cousin. And still, the operation runs because he's no longer running it. He designed it to run without him. And many people still think that this was his final genius, that by the time the state came for him, Francesco had already turned his identity into a blueprint. So what do you think? When does a man stop being a man and become a machine? Late that year, a small office in Rome compiles a report. 48 companies tied to a single network. 312 million euros moved through false invoices. 84 known associates. 2 identifiable leaders. They circle one name, Francesco Schiavone. But by the time the report is filed, Francesco has already moved again. Not geographically, but functionally. He's no longer the operator. He's the symbol. And even as the wind begins to shift, even as the lights in Rome burn through the night, Casal di Principe stays still. Because to most who live there, one truth remains untouched. He's still watching. The nights in Casal di Principe are longer now, not because of the seasons, but because of the silence that stretches further than it used to. It's no longer the comforting quiet of a system running smoothly. It's the kind of silence that listens back, the kind that feels like something's about to give. By 1993, the Casalesi clan is the subject of over a dozen active investigations across multiple provinces. Their companies are being dismantled, their assets seized, their foot soldiers arrested. And yet, nothing breaks. Because the structure is not held together by money or guns anymore. It's held by belief. Fear is a kind of faith after all, and the name at the center of that faith is still Francesco Schiavone. He hasn't appeared in public in months. His last known photograph is nearly 2 years old. When people talk about him now, they don't use verbs like said or did. They say things like, Francesco wanted, or Francesco decided. He's a ghost with voting rights. He's the man behind the curtain and the curtain itself. Meanwhile, outside his reach, the Italian state sharpens its sword. The Spartacus investigation becomes a full-blown operation, multi-regional, cross-departmental, relentless. Over 500 witnesses interviewed, thousands of pages of financial records gathered, arrest warrants drafted like grocery lists. But even so, one file remains incomplete. Schiavone's location. No wiretap captures his voice. No photograph places him at a scene. His farmhouse is empty. His villas are quiet. And yet, instructions continue. The clan still moves. There's a quote attributed to a frustrated magistrate around this time. We are chasing smoke that knows how to write, because Francesco's power now exists entirely in systems. He's built an empire that assumes his will, even in his absence. A developer signs a contract he believes Francesco would approve. A lawyer challenges a seizure order because this is how it would have been done. No order is given, but everyone acts anyway. That's when you know a man has become more than a man. He's become a method, but not all methods scale without friction. In the port of Naples, 2 low-level customs agents are caught taking bribes. They crack under pressure and name a logistics coordinator tied to the Casalesi. His arrest leads to a warehouse raid. The warehouse contains pharmaceuticals, tobacco, and digital equipment, all moving under falsified permits. This isn't just local smuggling anymore. This is international crime. Interpol begins watching. Germany, Switzerland, and even Spain submit formal interest in the investigation. Francesco's web has stretched too far, and with it, his control begins to fray. Internal discipline becomes harder to enforce. Younger men, who never met Francesco in person, start questioning the old rules. A few break formation. One tries to set up a side network in Salerno. Another begins dipping into payments destined for political friends. Francesco, still unseen, still unheard, responds in a way that reasserts everything. A car bomb in Salerno. No casualties. Just a warning. Just a signature. And a few weeks later, the Salerno man quietly retires. The message is clear. The structure still lives. And so does the man who built it. Still, Rome keeps digging. A task force specializing in anti-mafia finance begins piecing together the Casalesi's fiscal shell. Offshore accounts are tracked. Legal loopholes are sealed. Francesco's once murky financial empire begins to shimmer with outlines. That's when prosecutors discover something odd. A cemetery in a rural town outside Naples shows massive cash injections for upgrades. New marble, maintenance staff, electronic gates. But the contracts? All signed by a non-existent company. When traced, it leads back, like so many trails, to an accountant who vanished in 1991. Why fund a cemetery? Because it's the one place people rarely question. And inside its walls, cash, messages, drop-offs, even a code, fresh flowers. Confirmed delivery. One investigator calls it the post office of the dead. Schiavone, it seems, hasn't just built a network. He's built poetry into it. But all poetry ends in a period. This is when the first serious betrayal happens. Antonio Joven, one of the rising strategists of the Casalesi clan, smart, articulate, cautious, begins cooperating with law enforcement. Quietly, carefully. At first, only small things, then more. He names companies, relationships, funding routes. Still, he never names Francesco directly, because Iovine doesn't know where he is either. Francesco has gone beyond hiding. He's gone off script. There's no one who sees him regularly anymore. No one who speaks to him without intermediaries. Some claim he's in the Alps. Others say he lives in a tunnel beneath a vineyard. One even suggests he lives as a monk in a small Umbrian monastery under a different name. The truth? Francesco is still in Campania, still watching, still moving, just differently. There's something profoundly close to the character here. He always knew this day would come. Not the arrest. He may still think that won't happen. But the tightening, the closing, the moment where a man who built everything must begin dismantling the very paths he once paved. He's cutting roots now, not to destroy, but to survive the fall. He begins shutting down operations proactively. Businesses close without explanation. Properties are liquidated. Old lieutenants are given retirement stipends and quietly relocated. The machinery begins to fold back in on itself, and yet the people, they don't forget. In town, a boy is scolded for using Francesco's name in a joke. His mother slaps him, says, "That name paid for your books." Across Caserta, even as arrests rise, loyalty lingers, like heat from a fire that's already gone out, because many people still think that even if Francesco is caught, nothing will change. So what do you think? Can a system built by one man truly vanish if the man does? Or does it learn to live on without him? The night before another major sweep, a full moon casts silver over the rooftops of Casal di Principe. A camera, mounted on a church steeple, picks up movement near the town square. A man in a dark coat walks alone, hands in pockets, no face visible. But those who watch the footage later, investigators, prosecutors, even rival clan members, agree on one thing. It was probably him. Because even when you can't see Francesco Schiavone, you feel him walking 5 seconds ahead of you. In early 1994, dawn breaks over Campania, like it always does. Soft light on crumbling walls, pigeons rising from the roofs, bread carts rolling through cobbled lanes. But under that familiar rhythm, something else moves. Something faster, more surgical. The arrests have begun. Operation Spartacus is no longer a rumor or a set of folders locked in an office in Rome. It's now a living thing, breathing down the backs of men who once believed they were untouchable. In the space of a month, 47 people are detained. By summer, that number has tripled. And while prosecutors still can't pinpoint Francesco Schiavone's exact location, his fingerprints are beginning to show, metaphorically and otherwise. Every financial trail, every phone tap, every whispered threat that can be traced back to a body on the ledger leads back to a single central gravity. And yet, the man is nowhere. His farmhouse is abandoned, the wiring ripped out of the walls. A vacation property in the hills has been stripped. No furniture, no personal items, just a kettle left on the stove, dry as ash. Surveillance footage from a gas station shows a man who might be him. He wears sunglasses, buys water, doesn't speak, leaves in a car that turns off the main road 40 seconds later, and vanishes. A task force commander in Naples tells the press, "Schiavone is not hiding, he's erasing, and he's right. This isn't retreat. This is controlled demolition. Francesco is burning bridges before the enemy can cross them." He begins dismantling the clan's footprint in stages. Waste contracts are abandoned, shipping routes rerouted, shell companies liquidated or handed off to outsiders. What remains is leaner, colder, an ice-veined network that doesn't bleed, but it also no longer grows. The Casalesi are entering preservation mode. And that, to some, is more terrifying than expansion, because a shrinking empire is a paranoid empire, and a paranoid empire is a dangerous one. Within the clan, pressure builds. Older bosses begin to question Schiavone's absence. Some call for new leadership. Others quietly signal to law enforcement that they might cooperate for the right price, the right terms, but none of them move, because no one is sure he's really gone. There's a story from this year that spreads like ink on wet paper. A mid-level operator, recently promoted, holds a meeting in a cafe. He speaks confidently, loudly, suggests that maybe Sandokan's reign is over. 2 days later, his mother receives an envelope. Inside is a photo, her son, taken from across the street. No message, no threats, just a timestamp. 5 minutes after his meeting, the operator resigns that night, leaves the country, because no matter what the newspapers say, Francesco Schiavone is still listening. And that's the real control, isn't it? Not from presence, but from possible presence. He could be anywhere, even nowhere, but he might be watching, and that's enough. There's a mainstream historical moment to anchor here. As the Spartacus trial approaches, the Italian judiciary prepares what will become one of the longest, most complex mafia trials in European history. Hundreds of defendants, dozens of judges rotated for protection. The country braces for a showdown between the state and a criminal system that has operated like a parallel government for decades. At the heart of the case, Francesco Schiavone. But still, no capture, no mugshot, no confession. Only the ghost at the center of the machine. By late 1994, prosecutors shift their approach. If they can't catch him through the streets, they'll try the wires. A massive surveillance operation begins across payphones, safe houses, relatives, and even public events. Microphones are placed in funeral homes, hospital waiting rooms, and post offices. And then, finally, a voice. A wiretap on a mechanic's shop catches a conversation between two men referencing a doctor who doesn't speak unless necessary. The way they talk, it's clear they're afraid of this man, that his silence carries consequence. The shop owner, questioned later, says nothing, just shakes his head. But investigators believe they've heard what they needed. Not proof, but tone. The kind of silence that only comes from someone who knows Francesco Schiavone is still pulling strings. A raid follows. 3 arrests. 1 notebook seized. Inside the notebook, maps, dates, numbers, and initials. 1 page simply reads, FS, on last wall. It becomes a rallying cry among prosecutors. They print it in reports. They use it as a code name, because now everyone knows. If you breach this wall, you breach the empire. But Francesco, even in his distance, is still 2 steps ahead. He stops using phones entirely. Messages are passed by hand. Men carry them sewn into clothing, disguised in envelopes addressed to non-existent cousins. No one carries a full sentence, only fragments. A meeting in a church confessional, a blink from a stranger at a traffic light, a piece of chalk drawn on a trash bin. To outsiders, it's madness. To insiders, it's protocol. Here's something close to the man himself in this moment. Francesco believed that systems must anticipate collapse. That power meant not holding forever, but surviving destruction. He wasn't building a fortress. He was building a memory palace, something that, even when dismantled brick by brick, would remain standing in people's minds. And it works. Many people still think that by 1994, the Casalesi should have imploded, but they didn't. So what do you think? Is a criminal state still a state if its citizens don't defect? Back in Casal di Principe, life goes on. The market still opens. The bells still ring. Children walk to school under streetlights funded by front companies. And one night, a priest lights a candle during Mass and pauses. Someone asks what's wrong. He says, I thought I saw him in the back pew. They look, nothing, just shadows. But even the priest, a man of God, says softly, if it was him, then let him be. Because even the holy understand some men are better left unwitnessed. It's early 1995, and the world has shrunk for Francesco Schiavone. Not in power, he still casts a shadow over every decision made from Caserta to Naples, but in movement. The open world he once walked with a slow, deliberate stride has become a tighter, dimmer corridor. And yet, within those walls, he feels more in control than ever. Because control to Francesco was never about space. It was about precision. From his new hiding place, believed by many to be somewhere in the rural hinterlands between Casal di Principe and Santa Maria Capua Vetere, Francesco orchestrates operations with the calm of a conductor. Messages move in loops, rarely in straight lines. Orders are not spoken, they're interpreted. Loyalty is maintained not by fear anymore, but by routine. You do today what you did yesterday. That is the law now, even as the Italian state closes in. The Spartacus investigation has become a national obsession. Police operations intensify. Arrests climb. Informants multiply. Forensic accountants work overtime, digging through contracts, unearthing shell companies that stretch into Eastern Europe and across the Mediterranean. And yet, Francesco's name stays just out of reach, always present, never pinned. Prosecutors refer to him as Il Capo Fantasma, the ghost boss, and his myth only grows. One newspaper article claims he hasn't been seen in public in over 200 days. Another reports that investigators found a bedroom sealed behind a fake wine cellar, with fresh linens and a still warm cup of espresso. He had left 10 minutes before they arrived. A journalist asks a retired investigator, "How is this man always one step ahead?" The investigator shrugs. Because he doesn't wait for steps. He listens to floors. That's the brilliance of it. Francesco doesn't react. He reads the atmosphere. He doesn't move quickly. He moves correctly. And when others panic, he becomes still. Here's something close to the man himself. He was once asked by an old friend, back in the early 80s, what his biggest fear was. Not prison, not death, not betrayal. He answered, irrelevance. And now, at a time when most fugitives would focus only on survival, Francesco continues to write, by proxy, by signal, by structure, his relevance into the walls of southern Italy. A new hospital is being built in a town not far from Casal di Principe. It's a state-funded project, awarded through public bidding. On paper, everything is clean. But somehow, mysteriously, all the subcontractors trace back to companies that pay dividends to anonymous holding firms. Firms controlled by Swiss accounts linked to names that used to be associated with Francesco's operations. It's not a crime. It's a concept, an idea woven into the cement and contracts of everyday life. Many people still think that this is the greatest danger he ever posed. Not in violence, but in normalization. He made it normal to expect envelopes instead of applications. Normal to build without permits. Normal to be quiet. So, what do you think? Is it more dangerous to be feared or to be expected? Meanwhile, within the Casalesi clan itself, discipline starts to erode. A younger lieutenant, eager, impatient, orders a killing in broad daylight. Sloppy, flashy, unnecessary. It brings unwanted media attention and scrutiny. Word gets back to Francesco. He doesn't yell. He doesn't summon the man. Instead, he sends a gift, a book of military history, marked at the chapter titled Tactics That Lose Empires. The lieutenant resigns within the week. That's Francesco's version of a bullet now. A reminder, because the war isn't won by explosions, it's won by endurance. But he feels the pressure mounting. He watches from a safe distance as the Spartacus trial prepares its first formal charges. The state is building its foundation carefully. Witnesses are housed under armed guard. Testimonies are recorded under seal. Judges are rotated to prevent leaks, and Francesco, for all his foresight, knows something is changing. The game board is tilting. Technology is catching up. Surveillance methods are improving. Informants are being offered new identities, even new lives. The state has learned from Sicily's mistakes, and the Casalesi, they're still playing the old game. He begins consolidating power even further, streamlining operations to a select few trusted men. The outer circle is cut. Redundant channels are shut down. Communication becomes even more minimalist. Sometimes, just a name on a receipt. Sometimes nothing at all, just a shift in a payment pattern, like a tide changing under a full moon. One day, a message reaches him through a priest. A folded mass card passed from hand to hand. Inside, a list of names: prosecutors, journalists, potential witnesses. Francesco doesn't act on it. He burns it. Because even he knows there are some fires that burn back. There's a mainstream historical development worth noting here. In 1995, the Italian state made sweeping legislative changes to accelerate anti-mafia prosecutions, fast-tracked trials, broader surveillance permissions, and most important of all, the rise of super witnesses, pentiti, who began offering detailed confessions in exchange for protection. The Casalesi were hit hard. Within 6 months, 3 key figures flipped, and one of them had met Francesco once, only once, but it was enough to offer a description, not of the man's appearance, but of his methods. The prosecutors now had something closer than a photograph. They had his process. Still, he stayed ahead, just barely. There's a rumor, never confirmed, that Francesco used to disguise himself as a delivery driver, making runs between safe houses under the identity of a mute man with a bad hip. The disguise wasn't about hiding. It was about observing, listening to the streets that once bowed for him. If true, it would mean he walked past investigators, past rivals, maybe even past the very men hunting him, and not once was he stopped. Because even now, in the waning light of his freedom, Francesco Schiavone was still more shadow than man. Back in Casal di Principe, his name is still unspoken, not out of fear anymore, out of ritual. He has become a custom, a habit baked into the rhythm of everyday life. You don't speak his name the same way you don't whistle in church. You just remember to keep your debts paid, your voice low, and your eyes forward. Because even when the state closes in, even when the trial builds like a storm behind the hills, even when everyone knows the curtain must fall, somehow, Sandokan still walks the earth. It's 1996 now, and the noose is tightening. Not just in the streets of Caserta, not just in the corridors of Rome, but inside the very structure Francesco Schiavone built. The Casalesi clan, once a well-oiled machine with more discipline than a military division, is showing signs of fatigue. Tiny hesitations in meetings, delays in payments, whispers between soldiers who used to speak only in nods. Pressure always finds the cracks. The Spartacus trial has formally begun. Hundreds of defendants. Testimonies stack like bricks. Courtrooms overflow. Journalists circle like moths around courtroom doors. Judges arrive under guard. Italy is watching. Europe is watching. But even now, they don't have him. Francesco Schiavone remains a fugitive. A name whispered through phone lines, scribbled in margins, passed under tables. He's more present in his absence than most men are in life. And the longer he evades capture, the more powerful his legend becomes. Some start calling him l'invisibile, the invisible one. But the truth? He's very much present. He's just changed shape. His days now are spent underground, literally. It's widely believed that Francesco has taken refuge in a hidden bunker system built beneath a rural compound just outside his hometown. Built years earlier under the guise of agricultural storage, the structure is soundproof, self-contained, and far more sophisticated than it appears. It has exits disguised as wells, ventilation masked behind barns, cameras tucked into trees. It's a labyrinth built for containment, not escape. And inside it, Francesco continues to govern. He receives daily updates via coded slips, messages sewn into seams, or relayed through trusted couriers disguised as migrant workers. He moves rarely, speaks less, eats alone, sleeps in small shifts. The walls around him are painted white, not for aesthetics, but for clarity. Every object has its place. Nothing is left to chance. He's no longer a boss. He's a monk of control. Meanwhile, on the outside, the trial thunders on. Day after day, Pentiti take the stand. They speak of meetings, murders, bribes, contracts, and disappearances. They speak of a man who never shouted, who never carried a weapon, who ran an empire with glances and pauses. And yet, even among those who flipped, none can say they really knew him. They describe impressions, moments, the way a room would change when he entered, the way a decision seemed already made before the conversation began. One witness describes it as being in a room with gravity. That's what Francesco was. Mass, pull, silence. And now, that gravity is beginning to collapse in on itself. The prosecutors are playing a long game. They don't need the dramatic arrest, though they want it. What they need is confirmation, connection, something more than silence. They start hunting paper ghosts, names and contracts, ownership transfers, phone numbers scribbled in the back of impounded ledgers. Every time they find a thread, they pull. And sometimes the fabric shifts. They find a shell company in Bari that once paid taxes under a P.O. box linked to a now shuttered bridal shop in Casal di Principe. The trail loops through Liechtenstein, disappears, and reemerges in a Neapolitan funeral parlor. Who signs the paperwork? No one knows. But every loop seems to breathe his name. And still, he watches. He keeps files, records, not on paper, but in memory, because here's something close to the man himself. Francesco trained his mind like a filing cabinet. He once claimed to remember every payment made in the month of March 1991, by name, amount, and method. An associate once tested him on it. Years later, he passed, and then quietly reassigned the associate to Albania. The lesson wasn't in the accuracy. The lesson was in the consequence of doubt. But even the sharpest mind begins to dull in confinement. Inside the bunker, Francesco starts pacing more. He begins waking in the night. He listens more often to the radio, not for news, but for music. A small battery-powered unit plays classical, soft, indistinct pieces with long silences. One night, he hears a piece by Ennio Morricone. He stands still for the full 3 minutes, and when it ends, he says aloud to no one. That's what it should have sounded like. It's the first sentence he's spoken in a day and a half. Back above ground, the town begins to shift too. Casal di Principe is no longer just feared. It's observed. Cameras appear at street corners. Reporters walk through piazzas with notebooks and press passes swinging on lanyards. Residents answer questions with shrugs, or silence, or long, tired sighs, because for them, the trial isn't a spectacle, it's a slow-motion earthquake, and they know that no matter the verdict, the ground has already changed. Still, the clan operates, thinner, quieter, but present. A food distributor goes bankrupt. 2 days later, a new one opens in the same building, same trucks, new name. No announcement, just motion, because motion is survival. And survival, at this stage, is everything. Many people still think that Francesco Schiavone could have fled the country by now, that he could be sipping coffee in Tunisia or walking the beaches of Venezuela under an alias. So what do you think? Is it cowardice to stay underground? Or is it devotion to the myth, to the system, to the silence? Because in that silence he still commands. One courier recalls delivering a coded message to a butcher's shop in town. Inside the envelope, a single line. Continue as planned. I am with you. No name, no signature. But the butcher wept when he read it, because it meant he still existed, because it meant the man still cared, because in a world built on whispers, a sentence is a resurrection. And in the echo of that line, Francesco Schiavone continued to breathe. By early 1997, Italy is restless. The Spartacus trial is no longer just a courtroom event. It has become a national mood. Every few weeks, another witness steps forward, another wiretap is released, another layer of the Casalesi onion is peeled back for the country to see. Journalists compare it to a modern inquisition. Each testimony not only reveals the mechanics of an empire, but forces the public to confront what it has ignored for decades. And at the center of that reckoning, still a ghost, still Francesco Schiavone, still free. He has now evaded capture for so long that law enforcement agencies no longer mark him on maps. They draw zones instead, shaded regions across Campania labeled likely influence. The heat maps glow with red where Francesco's name has never even been spoken aloud, and yet his will is clearly felt. It's a strange paradox. He is nowhere, and yet everything moves around him. Meanwhile, inside the bunker that no one can find but everyone suspects exists, Francesco continues to rule. His days are shorter now, not for lack of activity, but because he splits them into rituals. Everything is compartmentalized. Mornings are for intel, midday for coordination, evenings for silence. He eats sparingly. He exercises quietly. He reads. Sometimes he rereads old news articles about himself, not out of vanity, but to study how the world understands him, what image he's projected, what myths have grown in his absence. Here's something close to the man himself in this chapter. Francesco believes the most powerful lies are the ones people tell themselves. So he never corrected the stories, never denied the myths, never clarified the contradictions. Let them build my legend for me, he once said. It saves me the trouble. And legend is exactly what he's becoming. But legends don't protect the living. The state knows this. And with each month, its grip tightens. They shift tactics again. Less force, more starvation. Bank accounts freeze. Property seizures increase. Casalesi-owned businesses are audited, fined, harassed. Former allies begin to distance themselves. Even some family members begin to feel the weight. Not betrayal, just fatigue. The kind of fatigue that sets in when you've been holding your breath for too long. And Francesco knows it. He begins issuing fewer directives, not because he lacks control, but because the system he built is now self-sustaining. If someone asks what to do, it means they haven't learned. And in his world, failure to anticipate is failure to remain. A lawyer is caught transferring funds to a fake charity linked to one of Francesco's shell companies. The lawyer panics, cuts a deal, offers testimony. 2 weeks later, his family receives a letter. No threats, just a list of dates. His anniversaries, his child's birth date, his mother's operation. It ends with, remember what you stand on. The lawyer withdraws from the deal because sometimes the weight of memory is heavier than the weight of fear. Back in court, the Spartacus trial grinds on. They begin calling it a judicial marathon. Some days feature 6 witnesses. Others are delayed because of illness, threats, or vanished defendants. Prosecutors age during the process. Defense attorneys rotate in and out. Entire news cycles begin and end between testimonies. And still, Francesco's empty chair remains. One morning, a judge, exhausted, hoarse, addresses the courtroom. We try shadows, and in doing so, we illuminate the spaces they use to walk. The audience falls silent, because everyone knows who that line is about. In the town itself, strange things start to happen. A new generation comes of age. Young men and women who've never seen Francesco, never heard his voice, but still lower their heads when someone whispers, Sandokan. Children grow up in apartments built with Casalesi cement. They play in parks maintained by Casalesi shell companies. They go to schools where the desks were donated by anonymous benefactors. There's no plaque, no photo, but the imprint is clear. In one high school, a student is caught stealing a textbook. When questioned, he says, I thought it was already paid for. By him, and no one corrects him, because myth is easier than history. In one of the wiretap logs released this year, investigators catch a fleeting reference. He's not gone. He's sleeping with the wires. Some interpret it literally. Another underground hideout, maybe even beneath the region's electrical grid. Others say it's metaphor, that Francesco Schiavone is so embedded in the system now, he's indistinguishable from infrastructure. That idea haunts the prosecutors, because how do you arrest something that lives inside expectation? The Casalesi clan, under Francesco's long-distance direction, begins pulling tighter. Fewer operations, less visibility, but more loyalty. They start paying pensions to retired foot soldiers' families. They deliver groceries to widows without being asked, not because they're good, but because they know what legacy looks like. And legacy is what Francesco is now building. Not new money, not new territory. Endurance. He calls it the second breath, the idea that an empire's power isn't in its expansion, but in what remains after the fall, because many people still think that by this stage, Francesco should have surrendered, or fled, or died. But what do you think? Is surrender a weakness, or is survival itself the highest form of resistance? One final story from this year. A young priest, newly assigned to Casal di Principe, gives a sermon on redemption. He urges his flock to shed old sins, to reject the ghosts of the past. He ends with the words, even the strong must answer, eventually. That night, a letter arrives in the chapel's mailbox. No name, no address, just one line. Strength answers to no one. It remembers. The priest never mentions the Casalesi again. And in that silence, Francesco Schiavone speaks loudest. Spring of 1998 arrives not with birdsong or blooming fields in Campania, but with tension, a heaviness in the air that smells less like rain and more like consequence. The Spartacus trial is nearing its crescendo. Testimonies have taken years. Witnesses have been moved across continents, protected like diplomats. Some have disappeared. Others endure, scarred but breathing. And yet, amid it all, Francesco Schiavone remains out of reach. He is no longer just a fugitive. He is a symbol now of failure, of defiance, of something Italy thought it could outlast. The public is restless. Politicians argue over strategies. Law enforcement grows desperate. Even international observers begin asking, how does a man with no passport, no phone, no movement, still run a criminal system with more consistency than some elected governments? The answer lies in one word: design. Francesco didn't build a hierarchy. He built an ecosystem. Every part of it feeds the others. Even when cut off, one branch regrows. One man falls, another rises, and no one, not even his closest allies, sees the full picture. Because Francesco is no longer part of the Casalesi clan. He is the operating system. At this point, he has been underground for over 4 years. 4 birthdays, 4 Christmases, 4 years of filtered sunlight and echoing footsteps and coded messages passed through locked networks. But those years weren't spent hiding. They were spent reconfiguring. Inside his bunker, believed now to be nestled under a working vineyard owned by a straw family, Francesco has pared his life down to simplicity. The walls are clean, the air recycled. His schedule is routine, but his mind remains moving. He reads every message carefully, reviews every list. A slip-up by a contact in Frosinone is noted. A payment in Trieste arrives late. Nothing is punished hastily, but everything is recorded. He believes always in patterns. A favorite quote of his from this time is whispered by one courier to another. If a mistake is new, correct it. If it's repeated, bury it. And this is where 1998 becomes more than a year. It becomes a reckoning, because now the state knows where he is. They can't prove it, can't draw it on a map. But they feel it, like warmth under floorboards. Surveillance zones narrow, patterns emerge, logistics shift around a single hidden core, so law enforcement stops chasing him directly. They go after his oxygen. A sweep begins. Not of men, but of services. Vehicles impounded, food suppliers raided. Even medical contacts, those quietly paid to treat wounds and fevers in the shadows, are arrested or disappear under suspicion. The goal? Suffocate the system until the core chokes, and for a moment, it seems to work. Francesco stops issuing directives. Payments are delayed. Meetings postponed. The Casalesi begin to stall, uncertain. Rumors swirl that maybe, just maybe, Sandokan is finally dead. That his bones lie buried beneath one of his many safe houses. That the silence is no longer intentional, but permanent. But then, a message appears. 3 funeral wreaths arrive at the gates of the Naples tribunal. Each one bears the same card. One word, aspettate, wait. And just like that, the machine exhales. Because the message isn't just a taunt, it's a reset. The silence wasn't death, it was recalibration. And now, the pressure turns the other way. Because while the state has made progress, it has also made enemies. Inside its own walls. Leaks begin. Key evidence disappears. A judge is reassigned mid-trial after receiving a series of untraceable threats. One investigator's home is broken into. Nothing stolen, except his daughter's school calendar, pinned to the fridge. A quiet war is unfolding beneath the legal process. And Francesco? He keeps walking the narrow halls of his subterranean life, hands behind his back, eyes focused on nothing in particular. He is not bothered, because the longer he is unseen, the more deeply he is believed. That's the paradox he always counted on. Even his enemies now speak of him like a fable. A senior police official, pressed by a journalist, admits, "We're no longer looking for a man. We're looking for the reason men obey." Meanwhile, the world above him keeps turning. New arrests, new witnesses. The Spartacus trial is on its 400th hearing. One prosecutor jokes bitterly, "We may die of old age before we see a conviction." But even as the system grinds forward, even as some Casalesi members begin to crack under the weight of the proceedings, Francesco's core remains untouched. Because here's something close to the man himself. He never wanted to be forever. He wanted to be the rule that outlives its creator. And so, while others pray, protest, or surrender, he plans. He begins mapping a new order. Smaller. Tighter. Not based on the old logistics of drugs or trash, but digital laundering, trade licensing, and silent partnerships with Eastern European firms. He will no longer move cash. He will move influence. And many people still think this was his final evolution. Not as a king hiding in exile, but as a strategist who understood that sometimes, when the war is too loud, you simply build a new battlefield. One final story from this year. A teenage boy is caught tagging a wall in Caserta. It's nothing major. A sloppily drawn crown. Some curse words. The police arrest him. His father, once a low-level driver for the Casalesi, refuses to pay bail. That night, the father finds an envelope on his porch. Inside is a Polaroid. His son asleep in the cell. No message, no threat, just proof that someone's still watching. The next morning, the bail is paid. The wall is painted over, and the crown never appears again. Because even now, after years of silence, after the ground has shifted and the laws have changed, The shape of Francesco Schiavone's presence still walks ahead of every step in Caserta, and no one dares step too far beyond it. Summer 1998 arrives hot and brittle, the kind of heat that bakes old roads and makes silence feel louder. In the courtroom, the Spartacus trial crawls forward, testimony by testimony, name by name. The docket reads like a phone book from another planet. Aliases, false companies, businesses that never existed but somehow generated millions. And yet, the one name that everyone is there for, Francesco Schiavone, remains absent. Still no arrest, still no verified sighting, still just the hum of a machine running on his blueprint. The prosecutors have begun referring to him as the absent king, not in mockery, but in quiet awe. Because every time they think they've found the nerve center of the Casalesi clan, it turns out to be just another layer, another mask worn by a mask, covering a mask. And behind all of it, always, Sandokan. But even the deepest tunnels begin to hear footsteps. For the first time in years, Francesco feels closeness. Not panic, not fear, just closeness. The air changes in his underground home. One courier returns pale and jittery, having been followed through a checkpoint. Another fails to show at all. A backup route is compromised. A field that once served as a message drop is now being surveyed by a state-owned company preparing to lay fiber optic cables. The world above is modernizing, and modernity brings unwelcome light. Still, Francesco doesn't change course. He doubles down on stillness, because here's something fundamental to the man. He believes that motion invites interception. Stillness, though, it forces the enemy to guess. And guessing is where mistakes are made. So he slows even further. Fewer messages, no new orders. He turns the Casalesi into a kind of religious order, its structure surviving on old instruction and unwavering faith. And they do survive. Because to question Francesco's silence is to question the one truth that has held this world together since the 1980s. He knows what he's doing, but outside, Rome is losing patience. The public is angry. Citizens want closure. Politicians want victories. And prosecutors? They want the man behind the curtain. So they launch a final phase. Coordinated sweeps across every known Casalesi contact in Campania and Lazio. Dozens arrested. Safe houses raided. Communications seized. And still, no Francesco. Until a slip. It happens in the most mundane way imaginable. A relative, young, untrained, new to the system, delivers a meal to a farmhouse outside Casal di Principe. He leaves the plate in the usual place, but forgets to erase the tire tracks on the private road behind him. They're spotted by a passing carabinieri patrol. Odd for a property believed unoccupied. Surveillance begins. They see no movement for days. Then, one night, a faint light appears. Then it disappears. That's all it takes. The next morning, a decision is made. August 10th, 1998. Before dawn. No sirens. No spectacle. Just precision. Dozens of officers, some in tactical gear, others in plain clothes, encircle the farmhouse. They do not knock. They move fast, slicing through the property like surgeons. Inside, they find a false wall, a steel hatch, a set of stairs, and then a narrow corridor. At the end of that corridor, in a room no larger than a prison cell, they find him, Francesco Schiavone, sitting at a desk, not hiding, not armed, just waiting. He looks up, nods, and says only, "Took longer than I thought." There is no struggle, no last-minute confession. He stands, puts on his shoes, and walks out flanked by officers. Outside, the sun is rising, and for the first time in over 4 years, the shadow that has ruled Campania from beneath its streets steps into the daylight. The news spreads within minutes. Television anchors interrupt broadcasts. Radios crackle with the announcement. Even international press picks it up. Italy's most wanted fugitive captured after 1,180 days underground. In Casal di Principe, people react with a strange mix of disbelief and relief. Some close their shops for the day. Others pour wine. But most, they stay quiet because the myth was never about the man. It was about the space he occupied. And though the man is now in handcuffs, that space, the silence he taught them to live inside, still holds. At headquarters, Francesco is processed like any other suspect. Fingerprints, photographs. A lawyer is provided. He refuses a statement. But when asked to confirm his identity, he simply says, "I'm Francesco Schiavone. You already know the rest." The final face of the Spartacus trial has entered the courtroom. Finally, physically. But in many ways, it feels like a postscript, because the Casalesi have already begun mutating again, adapting, surviving. And Francesco? He's calm, even behind bars, because he never expected to live forever. He only expected to last long enough to make sure the system outgrew him, and in many ways it has. Many people still think that with his arrest, the Casalesi would collapse, that the silence would break. But what do you think? Can you truly imprison a man who spent his life erasing the need for presence? Because long after his capture, long after the last flashbulb fades, long after his cell door slams shut, the people of Caserta still lower their voices when they say his name, and they still call him what he always preferred, Sandokan. There's something almost unnatural about how calmly Francesco Schiavone adapts to prison. No protests, no complaints, no grand pronouncements about injustice or vengeance. He enters the system like a man boarding a train he'd already packed for years earlier. He doesn't ask for special treatment, doesn't make demands. His lawyers handle the legal theater outside. Inside, Francesco simply waits, because here's something essential to understand. He never believed he would avoid capture forever. What he believed in was being ready, and he is from the first moment he steps into his cell. Francesco takes inventory, not of what's missing, but of what he can still control. The time, the silence, the information that flows in and out, and most of all, his mythology. Because while the state has captured the man, the idea of Sandokan still moves free. He refuses interviews, declines all television requests. When a high-profile journalist offers to write his authorized biography, Francesco sends back a note with only 4 words. Write your own legend. That's what the prosecutors don't understand. They've caught him, but they haven't undone him. The Spartacus trial surges ahead with new energy now that Francesco is behind bars. His presence gives the proceedings a sense of closure. The other defendants watch him carefully, some with awe, others with fear. Even those who once wanted his seat now hesitate, because no matter what happens in court, he arrived last, not weakest. In fact, it becomes a kind of quiet point of pride among the Casalesi. Everyone else broke. He held. Over the months, investigators interrogate him multiple times. They offer deals. They present evidence. They try to crack him the way they cracked others. But Francesco isn't built for breaking. He's built for endurance. He speaks in complete sentences, measured and neutral. Never raises his voice. Always chooses precision over protest. When asked directly if he ever gave orders to kill, he responds, "You are asking me to assign verbs to shadows." The room falls silent. The prosecutors scribble. But they don't get what they want. Not from him. Never from him. Meanwhile, the world outside shifts. Italy changes governments. Global headlines move on. But in Casal di Principe, nothing changes, because Francesco's systems, his rituals, his principles, those weren't tied to his physical presence. They were taught, copied, institutionalized. A new company appears handling trash disposal under a new name. A school is renovated. The same 3 construction firms submit bids, all from different regions, all traced, if you dig deep enough, back to subsidiaries of the old Casalesi shell firms. It's not active control anymore. It's legacy. And legacy, as Francesco always believed, doesn't need eyes. It needs memory. Here's something close to the man himself. He doesn't write letters from prison. He dictates them to a single lawyer, who memorizes them word for word. The lawyer isn't allowed to bring notes, only to deliver words exactly as they're spoken. When asked why, Francesco says, "The written word belongs to history. I only belong to function." And yet, function itself is shifting, because many of the younger clan members, the ones who came of age while he was underground, don't remember the man, only the legend. They revere him, yes, but they do not know him. Some grow reckless, others grow independent. They start engaging in crimes Francesco would have deemed messy. There's a bank robbery in Naples, unusual for the Casalesi. Loud, flashy, public. When investigators find a link back to a distant affiliate of the clan, they know something is changing. The old order is fraying. Inside his cell, Francesco learns of the event through his lawyer. He closes his eyes, says nothing, because he knows what's happening. He prepared for it. Empires eventually bend. But what matters is how long they echo. In 1999, the Spartacus trial enters what the press calls its final stage. Closing arguments begin. The courtroom is filled daily with reporters, law students, politicians. Everyone wants to hear the verdict. Everyone wants to be there when this chapter of Italian criminal history is sealed. And Francesco? He isn't watching. He reads instead. Mostly history, sometimes economics, rarely fiction. The guards notice that he eats less, but never refuses food. That he walks daily in the yard, but never paces. That he watches clouds more than other inmates. One guard writes in his daily log, "Subject seems entirely unbothered by imprisonment." Like he knew it would end this way. Maybe it's because he did. Because for Francesco, the walls of a prison were never narrower than the streets of Caserta. He was always confined by attention, by caution, by his own creation. This is just another room, and when the verdict arrives, it lands like thunder. Life sentence, guilty on multiple counts, conspiracy, murder, racketeering, extortion, trafficking. A sweeping blow, a message to the country. We got him. But here's the problem with thunder. It's loud, yes, but it fades, and in that fading silence, the system breathes again. Within a year of the verdict, small signs emerge. A contract awarded to a familiar name. A firm in Bologna with ownership ties to a man once on trial. A pension fund paid out to a relative of a former soldier. The machine never stopped. It only restructured. Many people still think the arrest of Francesco Schiavone marked the end of the Casalesi clan. But what do you think? Can you kill something that already knew how to survive your bullets? In 2000, a journalist attempts to visit him in prison. She's denied an interview, but her report ends with this line: "You cannot visit a man who became a method." And that may be the most accurate summary yet, because in the stillness of his cell, in the way he listens to the wind move through the bars, in the way he keeps his eyes low when guards pass, Francesco Schiavone is not resigned. He is remembering, and he is waiting. The cell is colder in winter. That much Francesco Schiavone has come to accept. By January 2001, he has been imprisoned for nearly 2.5 years, serving a life sentence handed down not just by a judge, but by an entire nation's need for resolution. To the world outside, the story seems over. The lion is caged. The case is closed. The system has won. But inside that cell, Francesco does not see an ending. He sees maintenance. His days follow quiet, exacting rituals. Wake, wash, walk, read, think. He eats sparingly, talks little. The guards describe him as polite but distant. In the yard, he walks alone, not for safety, but by choice. Other inmates avoid him, not because they're afraid, but because they somehow understand. This is not a man to be crowded. He has become, in essence, an institution within an institution. And while the trial may be over, the system he built is not. Outside the walls of his prison, the Casalesi clan still exists. It's different now, less centralized, more cautious, but the machine breathes on. Many of the old bosses are either dead, imprisoned, or retired, but the infrastructure remains, and that's the part so few outsiders understand. Francesco didn't build an empire that required him to move its parts. He built one that moved around his absence. Here's something close to the man himself. In his youth, he was fascinated by old clocks. Hand-wound, precise, intricate. He once told an associate, "A good machine should outlast the hand that made it." And his machine has. In 2001, Italian authorities continue to dismantle Casalesi assets. Seizures of real estate, companies, and vehicles continue. Police carry out raids on warehouses and logistics centers across Campania. Each success is announced in press conferences with charts and bold headlines. But every time a piece is removed, another appears. A company dissolved in Naples is reincorporated in Benevento. A transport business closed by the state is rebranded and reopened under a cousin's name in Foggia. Financial regulators chase paperwork, but the scent never quite leads to the center. Because the center no longer exists, it's been distributed. A finance officer reviewing a laundering scheme remarks, "It's like fighting smoke with scissors." The irony? That's exactly how Francesco designed it. And even now, from within his prison walls, he still influences outcomes. Not directly, not with orders or messages, but with precedent. A payment is made because that's how he would have done it. A silence is kept because he would have wanted it. A contract is awarded because he once shook that man's hand. It's not loyalty, it's muscle memory. In one of the court transcripts from late 2001, a mid-level Casalesi affiliate testifies under protection. He says, "You don't ask what Sandokan wants. You ask what Sandokan would have wanted." The distinction matters because it reveals the truth that haunts the entire anti-mafia operation. Francesco is no longer a participant. He is a reference. Still, time grinds on. In prison, he receives occasional visits from family, his wife, an adult son, a niece. These are quiet, restrained encounters. No displays of emotion. Few words. Sometimes they sit in silence. Sometimes he offers a sentence or two. Always short, always ambiguous. He never discusses the trial, never mentions the sentence, never speaks of guilt or innocence. Instead, he asks how the town is, how the roads are holding up, how the seasons have been, because Francesco Schiavone still thinks in terms of infrastructure. Meanwhile, the prison warden changes. The new man is younger, more skeptical. He orders a full review of Francesco's privileges, the books he's allowed, the exercise schedule, even the contents of his cell. Simple things like toothpaste, letters, clippings. Nothing contraband is found, just books, mostly about logistics, some on history, one on architecture. And in the margins of each, pencil marks. Not notes, but underlines. Short, surgical. Sometimes, just one phrase per chapter. One phrase is underlined 3 times in a book about the design of Roman aqueducts. Systems must be beautiful enough to last unseen. Back in Campania, the Casalesi continue evolving. The new generation, young men who grew up under Francesco's long shadow, begin reshaping the operation. Less extortion, more infiltration, fewer street enforcers, more corporate agents. They don't mimic his methods exactly, but his influence lingers. The way they speak, the way they hesitate before responding, the way they avoid excess, flash, or fame. Even when they fail quietly, because in his world, noise is weakness. Many people still think Francesco's era ended in 1998 with his arrest. But what do you think? Can a man's reign truly end when every lesson he taught is still being lived? One final story from this year. A local business owner in Caserta is approached by a young enforcer, someone eager to collect protection money. The owner declines, says the business is legitimate, that the old ways are done. The enforcer threatens him. 2 days later, a car pulls up to the enforcer's apartment. No weapons, no fight. Just an older man in a gray suit who tells him, "We don't do it that way anymore." The young enforcer leaves the region. No one knows who sent the man in the gray suit, but the old guard does. Because even from his concrete box, even with no phone, no knife, no throne, Francesco Schiavone is still writing footnotes on every page of Campania's underworld. And silence? Silence is still his language. Spring tiptoes back into Caserta. Outside the prison walls, blossoms begin to spill from neglected balconies and asphalt cracks. In a town where silence and memory share equal weight, even the seasons seem to wait for permission. But inside, time does not bloom. It endures. Francesco Schiavone wakes each day to the same faint hum of fluorescent light. He has learned not to mark the days. There's no calendar on the wall, just a growing familiarity with the way sunlight filters through iron bars at different angles across the year. Even the pigeons outside his cell follow a routine now, and yet change seeps in from the edges. In 2002, a small but seismic shift begins. Not in Caserta, not in Naples, but in Rome. The Italian state, emboldened by high-profile arrests and international pressure, starts drafting a new offensive, a coordinated plan to financially suffocate the mafia. It's not about guns anymore. It's about spreadsheets. The Guardia di Finanza and anti-mafia prosecutors begin scrutinizing every thread tied to Casalesi influence. Real estate, logistics, construction, waste management, agriculture, even funeral homes. If a euro moves without clear accounting, it earns scrutiny. But here's the kicker. Most of the trails still lead back to companies that once bore Francesco's fingerprints. Now they're gloves, shell companies, fake owners. Cousins with no history in business suddenly own 5 apartment buildings. A former bricklayer is now the CEO of an import-export firm that doesn't export anything. In a meeting among anti-mafia prosecutors, one of them says with frustration, "We aren't chasing people, we're chasing templates. But templates don't testify, and so the investigators keep digging through piles of paper, offshore transfers, falsified invoices. Every time they think they've cornered a lead, it slips, because the enemy isn't shouting anymore. It's whispering through systems. Meanwhile, Francesco keeps still. He reads less now, writes more. Letters mostly, some to family, some never sent. He folds them, unfolds them, rewrites entire pages without changing a word. Not because he's unsure, but because he wants the rhythm to be just right. There's a theory among the guards. They believe Schiavone writes in code, but they never find any encryption. No hidden ink, no substitutions, just clean, elegant prose. One of the guards, young, curious, not yet jaded, once tried to decode a particular letter. It read like a travel log, dull, uneventful. A walk through the town of Asera, descriptions of shutters, of cracked walls, of a bakery that no longer sells pastries. He underlined one sentence. Nothing changes except the angle of the shadows. The guard gave up. But maybe that was the point. Francesco had always understood the value of saying almost nothing. Here's something close to him again. He once trained a young associate by telling him to stand in a busy street corner and say nothing for 1 hour. When the kid returned confused, Francesco asked, "Did you notice who watched you longer than 5 seconds?" The lesson? Power doesn't move. It waits to be recognized. Outside, the Casalesi aren't as visible anymore. Gone are the days of men with mirrored sunglasses in corner bars. The new generation works out of offices, law degrees, tax consultancy firms. They wear suits that don't scream money, just quiet confidence. One of them, a man named Lorenzo, becomes a central figure. Mid-30s, no record, runs a real estate fund that seems ordinary, but somehow never loses value. Insiders whisper that Lorenzo never met Francesco, but he speaks of him like a disciple speaks of scripture. He refers to Francesco only as Il Fondatore, the founder. In one rare wiretap from a bugged restaurant, Lorenzo was overheard advising a partner, "Remember, we're not traders, we're cartographers. Sandokan drew the first map. We just fill in the color." The prosecutors note it, but again, there's nothing to arrest in a metaphor, and even metaphors cast shadows. In 2003, an investigative journalist publishes a series on the invisible mafia. His argument? That modern Camorra structures, particularly the Casalesi, are no longer about violence, but about predictive behavior modeling. They've watched the system long enough to know its habits, its fears, its shortcuts. The piece stirs debate. Many people still think that organized crime must involve blood in the streets to matter. But what do you think? Is it more dangerous when it kills in silence? Back in the prison, Francesco reads the article, or rather he receives it. It's slipped into a book by a visitor. No notes, no marks, but he reads it twice, then sets it aside and picks up a volume on Byzantine architecture. Because that's the thing about Francesco he already knew. He didn't need the world to confirm what he'd designed, but he did want to see if they'd notice. In summer, the guards rotate again. A new director takes over, this one more progressive, interested in rehabilitation. He offers Francesco access to more library materials, even a chance to contribute to a written history of the prison's architectural evolution. Francesco declines the offer politely, but later that week he requests blueprints of the prison's original layout, not to escape, to understand how the space thinks. The warden shrugs, approves the request, and Francesco spends the next 2 weeks tracing corridors with his eyes, calculating sight lines, pressure points, escape bottlenecks, not for use, but to know. That's his power now. Observation without motion, design without presence. The guards say he barely eats, but somehow he never seems tired. A visiting priest once called him a man already embalmed in discipline, but even discipline can become a message. In September, a package arrives for Francesco, legal documents. When opened, they reveal the finalized seizure of one of the last properties still loosely linked to his name, a vineyard. Francesco looks at the papers and smiles because he remembers the vineyard, not for its grapes, but for the stream behind it. A tiny, cold channel that never ran dry, even in summer. He once told an associate that any land with hidden water was always worth keeping. So what does it mean now to lose it? Nothing, because by the time they took the land, the lesson had already spread. A week later, one of Lorenzo's associates is caught registering a company in the exact same region, on land adjacent to the stream. The state seizes the past. The clan invests in the edges. Francesco from his cell simply closes his eyes, not in sorrow, not in defeat, but in the quiet satisfaction of a man watching his design self-correct. By 2004, the phrase Casalesi clan has morphed from whispered threat to national shorthand. Politicians use it in speeches. Journalists folded into headlines with uneasy regularity. But inside the concrete bones of his prison, Francesco Schiavone, Sandokan, remains silent, not by force, by design. The more they talk about him, the less they understand him. Outside, something stranger is happening. The Casalesi legacy is fracturing, not from weakness, but from success. The younger men, now in their late 30s and early 40s, don't remember the wild days. They grew up in suits, not tracksuits. Their battles were fought with contracts, not Kalashnikovs. They study market trends, not police routines. And that's the quiet danger. One of them, Marco R., becomes a rising star in waste management. He speaks fluent English, attended a business school in Milan, and often dines with local council members. He brags, half-jokingly, that the only thing dirty about our waste is how clean the books are. Marco never met Francesco, but he quotes him. There's a difference between being invisible and being forgotten. That line, traced back to a prison letter dated 1999, has become scripture among the modern Casalesi men. It's passed around like a parable. And that brings us to a strange paradox. The man locked in a concrete box under 41 bis is now more influential than ever, because from silence comes interpretation. In some circles, Schiavone is seen as the philosopher of the underworld, a criminal who turned his life into a parable. In others, he's a cold strategist who simply designed a machine that no longer needs him. Even within law enforcement, opinions split. One investigator refers to him as the founder of postmodern mafia capitalism. Another simply calls him a ghost. But the impact is real. In early 2005, a sweeping anti-mafia operation called Operazione Spartacus begins its final rounds. After years of wiretaps, informant testimony, and document trails, the state prepares for mass indictments. It's one of the largest anti-mafia trials in European history. More than 300 witnesses, nearly 40 defendants, and although Francesco is already serving life, his name still headlines the case, because much of it began with his early rule. The courtroom, when the trial begins, looks more like a fortified embassy than a place of justice. Plexiglass, body scanners, armed escorts. Journalists wear bulletproof vests just to sit in the back row. One prosecutor opens with this line: "The Casalesi didn't just defy the state. They tried to replace it." He's not wrong. In towns across Campania, municipal decisions were once greenlit by clan approval. Even school renovations required quiet conversations with men in leather jackets. But now that grip is slipping. Publicly, officials cheer. Quietly, they panic. Because when you cut off the head, the body doesn't always collapse. Sometimes it grows new heads, ones you don't recognize, and those are harder to kill. Here's a mainstream historical fact. In 2006, the Italian parliament approved the creation of a centralized agency for the management of confiscated assets from organized crime, known as NBSC. Its purpose? Not just to seize, but to repurpose mafia wealth, turn villas into schools, farmland into cooperatives. It's noble, but guess who predicted it? In a 2001 letter, Francesco had written, "They will not just strip us of property, they will try to grow virtue from what they take. Let them. They do not understand that symbols cannot be reused." He was right in one way. A school opened in a seized villa in Santa Maria la Fossa in 2007. But residents refused to enroll their children. They said the walls still whispered. No one could prove what that meant, but nobody dared argue. Meanwhile, Francesco's letters begin to take on a different tone, less about operations, more about memory. He writes to his daughter, then a teenager, about growing up barefoot in a village where bread was more rare than sin. He tells her about the first time he held a coin that wasn't his, and how heavy it felt in his pocket. He doesn't confess. He just recounts. There's a power in recounting without defense. It forces the listener to decide whether to feel sympathy, Revulsion? Or something in between? That too is strategy, because Schiavone isn't after redemption. He's after completion. He wants the story to land with all its complications intact. No edits, no easy labels. And so he writes, "One day you'll see them tell my story without understanding the soil it grew from. You'll nod politely, but remember, truth and guilt don't share a room. They sleep back to back." It's a haunting image, and yet comforting. Some analysts argue that Francesco's letters should be published, that they provide a rare insight into the psyche of a mafia leader under isolation. Others push back, arguing that even in silence, he manipulates legacy. Many people still think that silence signals regret, that a man locked away, cut off from power, must surely rot with remorse. So what do you think? Can silence ever be a form of control? Because Francesco's silence speaks in ripples. In mid-2006, a minor political scandal breaks in Campania. A local administrator is caught accepting bribes from a shell company linked, 2 degrees removed, to a Casalesi affiliate. No violence, no intimidation, just quiet agreement in a parking garage. When asked about the connection to organized crime, the administrator shrugs and says, "It's not like anyone called me from prison." Exactly. That's how deeply engineered the system now is. Even Francesco's absence is structured. Even his name, when not invoked, still guides behavior. In September 2006, another seized Casalesi property is turned into a cultural center. During the opening ceremony, the mayor gives a speech about reclaiming dignity. But down the street, 3 businesses close that week. Not because of threats, but because the customers stop coming. Reclaiming a building is easy. Reclaiming impressions is harder. The ghost of Francesco Schiavone doesn't haunt rooms. He occupies assumptions. There's one final anecdote here. A journalist visits the prison to request an interview. He's denied, of course. Francesco doesn't speak. But as the journalist leaves, a guard hands him a slip of paper. Not from Francesco, but from another inmate who once shared a common yard. It reads, "He never told me who he was, but I knew. Because when the wind blew, he didn't blink." That image stays with the journalist. He includes it in a feature titled "The Mafia That Waits," and in a quiet cell, deep in a fortress that rarely sleeps, Francesco Schiavone folds a fresh piece of paper and begins again. The year is 2007, and the echoes of Francesco Schiavone's past still orbit the modern present like a persistent hum. He remains locked under the strictest isolation, his eyes dulled not from fatigue, but from habit. Routine is no longer a thing he resents. It is the tool he sharpens. Mornings blur into evenings. The food tray clatters. The guards switch shifts. And each time they look at him, they see not the man but the myth. He doesn't speak. He doesn't age, not visibly. He remains. Outside, the Campania region is undergoing its own transformation. The Italian state, emboldened by Operazione Spartacus, moves from conviction to confiscation. Real estate, businesses, vehicles, a harvest of the Casalesi's former dominion. But as any farmer knows, harvesting isn't the end. It's what you plant next that matters, and some plants are rooted deeper than others. There's a warehouse in Via di Briano, a former logistics hub once owned by a man long gone. On the books, it's now government property. In reality, it's a place of silent negotiation. Local contractors still meet there, not to break laws, but to remember how decisions used to be made. They keep the rituals. They pour coffee from the same tin. They talk in short phrases. The furniture has changed, but the cadence hasn't. This is how mafia culture persists, not just in crime, but in rhythm, and rhythm is hard to erase. Meanwhile, Schiavone's extended family faces a new kind of scrutiny. Some nephews are followed, some businesses quietly audited. One of his sons, now a young adult, finds himself shadowed, not by enemies, but by expectation. Will you be like him? A reporter once asks. He doesn't answer, because he doesn't need to. The legacy is a tight jacket, tailored by someone else but expected to fit all the same. One of Francesco's old lawyers comments in an interview, "He may be caged, but his words roam free." And it's true. Letters smuggled or leaked, comments passed from cell to cell. His insights are absorbed like commandments. One former associate, now turned community organizer, claims Schiavone's early discipline inspired his current activism. Is that absurd? Maybe. Or maybe it's proof that influence can be distorted into virtue if you spin it slowly enough. Here's a mainstream historical fact. In 2008, the Italian government established Libera Terra, a cooperative that works to transform seized mafia lands into socially beneficial projects, organic farming, youth workshops, and community housing. It's a bold move, but one that unintentionally validates a prophecy Francesco made in a 2003 note. They will try to bleach blood with sunflowers, but roots remember. And indeed, in one Libera Terra field in Caserta, the produce thrives, but none of the locals buy it. They smile, they nod. But when asked if they would eat tomatoes grown in mafia soil, most shrug. Some say no outright. Some say it doesn't feel right. The shadow of history lingers even in the fruit. Meanwhile, Francesco's mind, measured in margins and ink stains, remains sharp. A guard once reports, he solves crossword puzzles in his head, not the easy ones, the kind with historical metaphors. It's said that he once completed a week's worth of puzzles using only dates and street names. No pen, just silence and recitation. But beyond games, he writes, not memoirs, not manifestos, fragments, one-liners, short philosophical phrases scribbled on scraps, tucked inside law books and dictionaries. When guards discover them, they copy them before discarding. One becomes particularly infamous among inmates. Power is not what you hold. It's what people think you left behind. It circulates through 3 prisons in 2 months. It lands in a seminar on organized crime at the University of Naples. A student quotes it on his final thesis. The professor raises an eyebrow. "Where did you find this?" "From a friend, inside a book, no name." But they both know. The myth is now studied, not feared. Schiavone, by accident or by aim, has become a lens. Academics argue over him. Journalists dissect him. Former rivals quote him like a reluctant father. And in every discussion, his silence remains the loudest voice. There's a particular debate happening in late 2008 among scholars. Some argue Francesco was the last feudal Don, controlling land, people, politics. Others argue he was the first modern corporate criminal, managing distribution chains, logistics, and risk portfolios like a CEO. Many people still think that the mafia only survives through fear and violence. So, what do you think? Could influence, subtle, institutional, cultural, be the deeper poison? Because fear fades, but influence lingers. In 2009, the Italian film Gomorrah gains international acclaim. Based on the book by Roberto Saviano, it depicts the brutal underbelly of the Camorra world, the Casalesi world. Francesco isn't named, but he doesn't need to be. The entire tone, the hierarchy, the discipline, the ice-cold functionality echoes his architecture. When asked in an interview if he based any character on Schiavone, Saviano nods, but says, "He is too big for fiction. You have to look at shadows, not faces." The movie is banned in some neighborhoods, not because people disagree, because it feels too real. One elderly resident, after watching the film, says quietly, "I saw my cousin in that scene. I saw our kitchen." Truth, it turns out, doesn't always need names. In the following years, as technology advances, the mafia changes once more. Cybercrime, money laundering via crypto, shell companies on virtual islands. And yet, even the new generation of criminals whisper about the old names. Schiavone, Zagaria, Iovine, but only one carries the myth of silence. Only one is still referred to by a nickname from a 1970s TV series, Sandokan. A pirate, a warrior, a romanticized outlaw. It's absurd, yes, but that's how branding works, especially when no one is around to correct the story. Inside his cell, the seasons blur. Guards come and go. At night, he sometimes stands by the narrow window, not to look out, but to feel the shift in wind. One report claims that during a thunderstorm in December 2009, a guard found him smiling. No one knows why. Maybe it was the rain. Maybe it was the sound of power shaking the walls, and knowing that even thunder cannot rearrange the past. Or maybe, just maybe, Francesco was remembering. Not the violence, not the triumphs, but the walk to his first hideout. The smell of moss. The softness of the earth under stolen boots. He once wrote, "There are no real mafiosi. Only boys who never outgrew the first time someone feared them." Is that confession or deflection? That, like everything else, is up to us. The year turns to 2010. Francesco Schiavone has now been incarcerated for over a decade. His world is four walls, a cot, and the echo of his own thoughts. Yet outside, the threads he once spun continue to tremble and twist, some tightening, others unraveling. His name is invoked less in whispers now, and more in analysis, reflection, and the unexpected arena of media fascination. There is an Italian journalist, middle-aged and dogged, who's become obsessed with tracing the invisible hand of Schiavone. She speaks to retired police officers, relatives of former clan members, local shopkeepers. Her conclusion? Francesco's greatest success was not domination, but normalization. He made the mafia feel like municipal management, trash collection, business permits, construction contracts. Under him, it ran more smoothly than the town hall. One of her articles describes him as the gray mayor of Casal di Principe. It gains traction. Politicians scoff, but residents murmur. Some laugh, but a few nod in ways that aren't agreement, just a form of tired acknowledgement. There's a former Camorra courier now living in Turin under witness protection. He's agreed to a rare anonymized interview. When asked what Schiavone was like to work under, he doesn't hesitate. Structured, like an accountant with a gun he didn't need to show. The myth grows not through fire and blood, but through logistics. That courier recalls Francesco's obsession with schedules. Trucks had to move at exact hours. Drivers were told what roads to avoid, not for danger, but for potholes. Even silence was timed. You had 15 seconds to speak. After that, it meant you were lying. Control wasn't about yelling. It was about planning so well that no one needed to ask questions. By 2011, Italy's anti-mafia task forces shift again, focusing on a new enemy: infrastructure corruption. Bridges, roads, schools, all tainted by inflated contracts and kickbacks. And what's the blueprint? Many believe it stems from the Casalesi model. Ironically, Schiavone's precision becomes a case study, not in criminal law, but in bureaucratic reform. A graduate student in Milan writes his thesis titled, "The Casalesi Algorithm: Illicit Efficiency in Institutional Failure." It's meant to be academic, but the implication is haunting. In a society where legal systems collapse, illegality becomes efficient not despite the crime, but because of it. Still, time wears down even the sharpest stone. Francesco begins showing signs of wear. Not weakness, but erosion. His hearing deteriorates. He walks slower. His penmanship, once neat, grows jagged. But the silence remains absolute. When offered books, he refuses novels. Only nonfiction. Political history, geography, Italian jurisprudence. One prison psychologist notes, he consumes power structures like most men consume bread. And yet, in those quiet hours between dusk and lockdown, he sometimes pauses. A hand on the cold steel bunk, fingers tapping out a rhythm only he remembers. In 2012, a surprise visit. A priest from his hometown is permitted to see him. An old man, hunched but still firm in voice. They speak through glass, no contact. The conversation is short. The priest asks him simply, "Do you still believe in what you did?" Schiavone doesn't blink. He replies, "I believe in what I held together. There is no apology, but there is no pride either. Just a statement of structure, as if he were describing a bridge he once helped design." Back in Campania, the streets shift slowly. A new generation grows up in the shadows of confiscated villas and renamed boulevards. They know the stories, but only as echoes. Some dismiss them as fairy tales. Others romanticize them into urban legends. One teenager tags a wall with spray paint that reads, "Sandokan vive." It gets washed away within hours. But it's photographed first. It trends briefly on local social media. Comments are divided. Some outraged, others nostalgic. One user writes, "You can kill a man, you can't unwrite his myth." A former anti-mafia judge, now retired, is interviewed in a television special. He reflects on the era that birthed Schiavone's rise. "We fought criminals, yes, but we also fought a lack of alternatives. When the state abandons, someone else governs. Sometimes that someone wears a priest's smile and keeps the trains running on time." He chuckles bitterly. "Just don't ask where the tracks lead." By 2013, cracks form in Francesco's inner circle. Aging capos, long silent, begin whispering. Some flip, others vanish. The new generation doesn't revere him. They mimic him, but without the discipline. A wiretap in Naples catches two young dealers arguing. One says, "You're no Sandokan, you're sloppy." It's an insult, but also a barometer, because now his name isn't just a threat, it's a standard, and that's harder to erase than any nickname. The state, too, begins shifting tactics. In 2014, a new proposal aims to educate students using former mafia strongholds as history centers. One such building was once owned by a lieutenant of Schiavone. It's painted yellow, filled with books. Children play outside, supervised by ex-teachers and activists. One boy asks his teacher, "Was this where bad guys lived?" She smiles, unsure what to say. So she says, "Now it's where good people learn not to be bad." In an odd twist, Francesco Schiavone's influence ends up furnishing classrooms. Not directly, but by reversal. His silence forced a generation to speak. His methods inspired their dismantling, and his myth fueled a counter-movement. Still, he remains untouched. Physically frail, mentally locked. His letters shrink, his world contracts, but each breath he takes is noted. Guards treat him like a museum piece. One warden whispers, "He's the last of a kind that thought in maps, not guns." There's a question some still ask in hushed tones. If Francesco Schiavone were 20 again, born in this era of smartphones, surveillance, and social media, would he rise again? Some say no, the systems are too tight. Others believe he'd be a tech CEO, not a boss. And some, those who've read every court document, seen every coded note, say he'd never be caught. Many people still think that Francesco's downfall was inevitable, that time and justice always win. So what do you think? Is legacy a prison stronger than iron, or the last escape from it? Because in the end, history doesn't judge with law books, it judges with stories. And Francesco Schiavone, Sandokan of Casal di Principe, is no longer just a man. He is now a story, one carved in silence, but never truly quiet. In the silence of his cell, as another winter settles over Campania, Francesco Schiavone becomes a ghost still living. Not in the supernatural sense, but in the way a man outlives his own era, watching its shape change from behind bars. The mafia of 1998 no longer exists in the form he curated. The Camorra now mutates quickly, splintering into more violent, less disciplined factions. Kids with guns, no codes, and a thirst for speed. They live stream crime. They Instagram threats. Schiavone, who once corrected grammar in memos, would never recognize this chaos as his legacy. There's a quiet irony. The man who built the Casalesi clan, like a multinational corporation, now finds his world reduced to 2 square meters and institutional oatmeal. No handlers, no consigliere, just a bunk, a folded blanket, a daily walk, and the sound of keys clicking in locks. And yet his name remains potent. In 2015, a documentary series, slick, expensive, Netflix-bound, names him Italy's last strategic godfather. The footage includes blurry photographs, dramatized reenactments, and interviews with law enforcement. One episode, entirely in grayscale, is titled "The Man Who Outplanned the State." His family doesn't speak to the press, but whispers say his sons tried to walk away from the shadow. One became a quiet businessman, opening cafes in southern cities under different names. Another disappeared entirely. Rumors say he lives abroad, but no one confirms anything. The streets where Francesco once held court have changed. The villas confiscated in Casal di Principe now house public offices, art collectives, youth programs. One villa becomes a tech startup incubator, an odd twist of fate. The walls, once covered in leather and gold trim, are repainted white and filled with beanbags and Wi-Fi routers. A plaque at the gate reads, "From darkness to data, the rebirth of space." It's dramatic, but it works. Teenagers now walk past the old mafia streets without flinching. Some don't even know who Schiavone was. When asked, one says, "Wasn't he some pirate or something?" Close enough. Sandokan, the pirate name, has outlived the man, but even inside prison, some still visit him. Lawyers, priests, a few curious academics. One professor from Naples gets 30 minutes in 2016. He asks Schiavone about economics, about regional governance, about the balance between fear and loyalty. Francesco answers softly, "You control hunger, you control time, the rest obeys." The professor includes it in his book. Critics call it chilling insight. Others see it as poetic nihilism. Meanwhile, Francesco begins walking less. He eats slower. One foot drags slightly. Time, his old servant, now demands interest. In 2017, Italy changes its solitary confinement rules. Some think Schiavone may gain visitation, but prosecutors push back. They fear his silence isn't retirement, it's patience. They believe that even at 70, he could still whisper once and move pawns. Whether that's paranoia or respect, no one can say. But the state doesn't gamble. He remains isolated. Every few months, new gang arrests hit the headlines. Often, journalists try to draw lines back to Schiavone, a nephew, a former courier, a forgotten soldier now gone rogue. The map of the Casalesi network is redrawn endlessly, part speculation, part mythology. It's become less about him and more about the idea of him, the ghost of order in a land of spirals. One internal police memo calls him the template they can't delete. In 2018, a reporter manages to track down one of Francesco's former lieutenants, now out of prison, living under surveillance. In a rare moment of honesty, he says, "You know why Francesco worked? Because he never loved the power. He only loved the plan. And that's what scared everyone. You can bribe a greedy man. But what do you offer someone who just wants the map to be clean?" That's the word that surfaces again and again in every reflection on Schiavone. Clean, not morally, but structurally. He hated loose ends, hated mess. Even in the court records, his writing is precise. In the notebooks recovered from his villas, diagrams are hand-drawn to scale. Arrows curve like subway maps. Initials are carefully nested in circles, notations in the margins in red. One investigator once said, if he'd been born 30 years earlier, he might have built highways instead of heroin routes. By 2019, a cultural shift occurs. The new mafia is too loud, too fast, too violent. Italy begins romanticizing the older generation, not because they were better, but because they were colder, less public, more deliberate. Men like Schiavone are remembered not for their brutality, but for their restraint. That's the dangerous part, because nostalgia blurs everything. Even poison, given time, becomes perfume in memory. A film is proposed about his life. Producers argue over tone. Should he be portrayed as tragic, cunning, evil, noble? In the end, the project stalls. The story feels too unfinished because he's still alive. And silence, after all, doesn't give clear endings. In his prison, the guards rotate. Some arrive young, knowing only legends. One admits in an interview that he expected a monster. I just saw an old man staring at a wall. But then he adds, still, he looked like he was solving something. Outside, the world pulses on. New politics rise. Old neighborhoods fall. Globalization reshapes even the crime world. But somewhere in a cell, Francesco still moves his fingers against the steel frame of his bed, maybe counting, maybe remembering, maybe nothing at all, because some men are architects. And even when their buildings fall, they trace floor plans in the air, just to see if the blueprint still holds. Casal di Principe does not grieve loudly for its past. It mutters, it adapts. It paints over bullet holes with hopeful murals and opens community centers in old warehouses once used for storing smuggled cigarettes. Yet no amount of color or music erases the outline of what once governed here. Francesco Schiavone's shadow, though quiet, has not been fully exorcised. It clings to old bricks, to whispers, to the way certain men still step aside when a familiar car idles near a curb. Some call this memory. Others call it fear that refuses to die. But what happens when the architect becomes irrelevant? By the early 2020s, the remaining structure of the Casalesi clan begins to fracture. Law enforcement, empowered by decades of judicial precedent, now moves faster and strikes harder. The mafia's old protections, judges bought, files lost, favors traded, no longer function in the way they once did. Surveillance becomes digital. Encrypted chats, burner SIMs, ghost accounts. And the younger generation of criminals doesn't study codes. They study algorithms. The world has changed, and Francesco Schiavone, inside his steel box, has not touched a phone in over 2 decades. Yet even in his absence, something strange begins happening. Prison officials begin noting a pattern. Messages still pass with his name attached. Sometimes in prison yard whispers. Sometimes through coded graffiti. His alias, Sandokan, resurfaces like a brand. It's no longer a man. It's a myth. A new gang in Naples even adopts it as a nickname. Gli Sandokanini, the little Sandokans. They're reckless, barely organized, caught within a year. But their audacity draws attention. Why carry the name? An officer asks one of the boys during interrogation. The kid, barely 19, shrugs, because people listen when they hear it, still. And that's what the system never fully accounted for. The structure may collapse. The empire may crumble. But the brand, the legend, that's harder to kill. Francesco, of course, has no contact with these youths. If he ever hears about them, no record exists of his reaction. But he must have known that myth lasts longer than loyalty. He built his early plans on image, clean suits, punctual meetings, code words. It was theater with teeth. In another time, he might have been a logistics savant. But this was his stage. And now, even with the curtain down, echoes remain. One day in 2022, a newspaper runs a small feature titled The Last Gentleman of Crime. It's not about Schiavone directly. It focuses on the last surviving original lieutenant of the Casalesi, who dies in hospice care. But the article mentions Francesco more than 20 times. Photos of him in tailored suits, in grainy courtroom shots, in sketches made by courtroom artists are included. He hasn't been seen in public in decades, but somehow his face returns like a ghost each time another man in his orbit passes away. Even silence cannot erase his fingerprints from Italy's criminal memory. A prison guard, speaking anonymously, recounts watching Schiavone during evening hours, how the older man still keeps folded paper scraps, how he makes marks with a pencil on the backs of commissary receipts. What is he counting? No one knows. Perhaps debts, perhaps days, perhaps nothing. But then, in late 2023, something unexpected. A retired anti-mafia judge publishes a memoir. In it, he devotes an entire chapter to Schiavone, not just his crimes, but his clarity. The judge, who once signed the solitary orders against him, now refers to Francesco as the most dangerous intellectual I ever encountered. Because he made terror look like planning. It's not praise. But it isn't condemnation either. It's awe. That unnerves people. Italy has always had a complicated relationship with its villains. Some get sainted in popular culture, turned into soap opera anti-heroes. Others vanish into infamy. Schiavone, strangely, sits somewhere in the middle. Too refined to be monstrous, too methodical to be tragic. In a curious twist, university students now write theses on him. One political science major compares his territorial management structure to ancient Roman prefectures. Another likens his crime syndicate to lean startup models. Schiavone treated corruption like scalability, the paper claims. It sounds absurd, but also, maybe not. He knew how to move product, neutralize competition, and establish trust. He just did it with fear instead of funding. One day, a young law professor petitions for a monitored interview with him, not to absolve, not to glorify, but to understand. The request is denied. Francesco hasn't given a single media statement in over 25 years. Not one, not even a letter. His silence, at this point, is more legendary than his commands ever were, and yet, the state still watches him. Not because they think he'll return to power, but because they know his blueprint still lingers. That, more than any gun or bribe, was his legacy, the plan, the scalable, replicable system of influence that worked until it didn't. He isn't the king of crime anymore, but his logic still runs in the blood of operations no one can fully trace. You can dismantle a throne, but if you don't burn the architecture, someone else might build it again. And somewhere in his cell, Francesco Schiavone continues his walks, counts his notes, and watches the sun shift across his barred window, not because he dreams of freedom, but maybe, just maybe, because he's measuring where the shadows fall. The sun doesn't rise differently in a prison cell. It merely marks the passing of another day. No reward, no change of season, just the reminder that time still exists outside these walls. Francesco Schiavone no longer expects anything from time. Not leniency, not memory, and certainly not forgiveness. But outside, time keeps moving. And in its wake, the world reshapes the legend of Sandokan once again. By 2024, the town of Casal di Principe is a contradiction dressed in sunlight. On one side, local children bike through alleys lined with fresh murals, painted as part of community initiatives funded by anti-mafia foundations. On the other, abandoned villas still sit untouched, fenced off as property under investigation, crumbling slowly into thorned memory. Tourists sometimes pass through, lured by gritty documentaries or curious blogs. Some ask locals where the real Sandokan lived. Most receive a shrug or a polite lie. He was never really here, but he was, and some still remember the sound of his engine turning down the narrow roads, the precise flick of his hand at town squares, the silent nods exchanged without a word. The older generation doesn't say his name unless prompted. Not out of fear, at least not anymore, but out of a sort of exhausted respect, like mentioning a once powerful storm that long passed but reshaped the coastline. The new police chief of the region, appointed in 2025, holds a press conference early in his tenure. He promises modernization, more transparency, better community engagement. A journalist asks, "What about the Casalesi remnants?" The chief leans forward. "We're not just fighting a clan," he says. "We're fighting a legacy." He's right, because Sandokan didn't just build a system. He built a philosophy. Loyalty through fear, order through silence, profit through pressure. It was simple, brutal, and terrifyingly effective. And even as law enforcement swept through his operations with judicial hurricanes, that core idea, control, was never completely uprooted. One curious development surfaces in 2026. A mid-level informant, arrested in a sting involving international logistics fraud, claims to have found a coded ledger in an old Casalesi property, possibly written by Schiavone himself. The document is mostly numbers, place names, a few strange initials. The authorities send it to analysis, but no definitive connection is established. Still, the very possibility is enough to reignite questions. Is he still pulling strings? Unlikely. But does his blueprint still exist in hidden caches, dusty basements, passed hand to hand through generations of newer gang members? Maybe. And then there's the matter of his son, Nicola Schiavone, arrested years before, had once been rumored to be Francesco's heir apparent. But prison changes bloodlines. Nicola's trajectory ends not with ascension, but confession. He becomes one of the highest-ranking informants of the clan, providing testimony that helps dismantle dozens of cells. It's a betrayal by mafia standards, but some scholars argue it's not betrayal at all, just inevitability. The empire was unsustainable. Its leaders knew it, even Sandokan. So, what does Francesco think of Nicola's choices? He's never said, never written, never responded to inquiries, and that silence may be more telling than words, because in silence, there's either sorrow or strategy. Still, not everyone believes Schiavone is entirely done. In 2027, an anonymous leak circulates online, a letter claimed to be written by Francesco to an old associate. Its authenticity is never verified. The handwriting is close, but unproven. The content is philosophical, reflective, cryptic. It ends with a single line that stirs debate for months. Control is not ownership. Control is belief. Was it real, or a forgery crafted to spook authorities? Does it matter? The name still echoes. And as Italy continues tightening its laws, expanding surveillance, and implementing new AI-driven monitoring of organized crime, the ghost of Sandokan remains on every roadmap. In one strange twist of irony, a small academic journal in Europe runs a feature comparing mafia operational structures to early corporate governance models. Schiavone, once a name spat with venom, now appears in business school case studies, coded as Case S. One paper posits that had he applied his strategic mind in legitimate logistics, Francesco Schiavone could have been a billionaire CEO. Instead, he chose shadows. Maybe he never wanted spotlight. Maybe he believed real power always operated out of view. And perhaps that's why his final legacy isn't his fortune, most of which was seized, lost, or reabsorbed by the state. Nor is it fear. His reign of terror ended years ago. Its structure, rigid, efficient, designed for succession. Even if the men fall, the system limps on. In Casal di Principe, there's a local saying now: passed between teenagers, sometimes in jest, sometimes in warning. Don't be loud like a lion. Be patient like Sandokan. A boy says this to his friend before skipping school. They laugh. But beneath the joke, there's an echo of truth. Francesco Schiavone outlived his enemies not by hiding, but by enduring. No memoir, no last words, no confession, just the slow turn of a key, the quiet shuffle of slippers on prison concrete, and a gaze that never flinches when the guard opens the door. He isn't a man anymore. He's a myth in a tracksuit. And myths don't retire. The Casalesi clan's final thread to the old world begins fraying in silence. Francesco Schiavone remains behind bars in the same maximum security prison that has housed him since the late 90s. The guards change. The walls are painted. Surveillance improves. But his cell stays the same. He does not speak to journalists. He denies interviews. The silence now is not strategic. It's a choice. Or perhaps it's all he has left. But beyond those walls, the mafia landscape of Italy keeps mutating. In Naples, the Camorra splinters further, atomizing into smaller, more chaotic factions, each chasing territory with a desperation that the old clans never had to show. In Palermo, old Cosa Nostra families attempt subtle revivals, drawing on forgotten loyalties and tech-savvy apprentices. And in Rome and Milan, organized crime increasingly blends into suits, databases, cryptocurrency wallets, and legal loopholes. And yet, every time a new arrest is made, every time a new clan is profiled by the media, one name still reappears like a watermark under the headlines. Sandokan, not because he's active, but because the blueprint persists. Back in Caserta province, the villas that once belonged to Schiavone and his top lieutenants remain state-confiscated, many still draped in bureaucratic limbo. Some have been converted into community centers. Others stand crumbling, empty monuments to power gone stale. A few are daubed in graffiti from activists and school children, messages that say, "Never again," or "Mafia kills dreams." In 2028, a team of sociologists conducts interviews in Casal di Principe for a study on collective trauma and generational fear. Most young residents speak vaguely of the mafia, aware of it, yes, but distant, like a storm that passed before they could walk. A few older men and women lower their voices when asked. One woman, in her late 70s, simply says, "He didn't shout. That's why he scared us." The study's conclusion: the silence itself became a form of violence. Meanwhile, Sandokan's family is scattered. Most relatives changed names, moved towns, tried to scrub their presence from Italy's tight-knit databases and whispering streets. But in small communities, legends cling. A Schiavone name on a mailbox draws looks, comments, and sometimes trouble. A few grandchildren try to reclaim it, speak of redemption, charity, and renewal. One opens a bakery. Another becomes a school teacher. Each one quietly dragging the past like a heavy coat they don't wear, but still must carry. A young Italian filmmaker releases a semi-fictional miniseries in 2030, loosely inspired by the Casalesi era. It's stylish, dramatic, and paints Sandokan not as a monster, but a mastermind. The public splits in opinion. Some criticize it for glorification. Others call it an important cultural reckoning. Francesco Schiavone issues no statement. In the world of storytelling, silence can be more cinematic than words. One of the final pieces of the puzzle falls into place during a government probe in 2031. A decrypted message chain between two emerging Camorra cells references S protocol. Authorities believe it's shorthand for a logistics playbook that mirrors the original Casalesi operational model. Routes, dummy corporations, fallback identities, and a rotation of lieutenants trained to never gather in groups larger than 3 It's as if Sandokan had written an operating system, and like any system, it evolves through those who run it. But here's the strange twist. None of the new players reference him by name. They treat S not as a man, but a method. Francesco Schiavone, in a way, has been absorbed into the DNA of modern Italian organized crime. Not as a legacy boss, not even as a martyr, but as a framework, which makes one wonder, what was his final goal? Domination? Revenge? Wealth? Or was it something colder, more calculating? To be irreplaceable. If you vanish and they still follow your map, then you never truly disappeared. And perhaps that's the part that unsettles the authorities most. You can capture a man. You can lock his body, shred his finances, erase his interviews, and isolate his legacy. But if you cannot kill the idea, then you've only delayed the next version of him. Still, the world moves forward. In 2032, Francesco Schiavone's health quietly declines. Reports say he suffers from kidney issues, likely tied to decades of isolation and age. Medical care is limited in prison. There are no dramatic escapes, no deathbed confessions, just the slow, natural ending of a man who once terrified a nation. His passing is announced without fanfare. A single paragraph in a national newspaper. Francesco Schiavone, alleged boss of the Casalesi clan, died this morning in detention. He was 82. No funeral, no procession, no public grief, only silence. The same silence he weaponized. The same silence that shielded him. The same silence that, ultimately, defined him. And in that silence, Italy breathes easier, but never completely relaxed. Because even when a storm passes, its patterns remain in the soil, shaping what grows next. Now, as we drift toward the quiet end of this tale, take a moment to notice how still everything feels. The noise of power has faded. The echoes of commands, the wheels of getaway cars, the whispered orders in hotel basements, they're all gone now. All that's left is the man, or perhaps just the myth, folded into a quiet corner of history. Let your breath settle a bit slower now. Let the sharpness of earlier chapters soften into something more distant, more faded, like a photo left too long in the sun. You're no longer walking the streets of Casal di Principe. You're floating just above them, safe in your room, wrapped in the safety of sleep's first whispers. Even giants become shadows. Even empires lose their names. And even the fiercest silence eventually dissolves into peace. The roads Sandokan once ruled are just roads again. The men who feared him are long gone. The villas stand hollow, no longer haunted. Only the wind moves through them now, and the occasional curious bird. Tonight, you've traveled through decades of tension, legacy, and cold calculation. You've seen what power built on fear becomes when the lights go out. But now your mind can quiet, your thoughts can dim, and your body can rest. This story's finished, and so is the man they called Sandokan.